Welcome to Boring History Now, where we're taking a chill ride down the Nile. Picture warm sunshine, a generous river, and priests who won't touch fish not, even if it's grilled just right. We'll explore temples and markets to uncover the quirky reasons behind it all. So, kick back, relax, and let's dive into this fascinating journey through time. You open your eyes to a horizon the color of warm honey. The Nile slides past with the kind of lazy determination that makes you wonder if it's secretly trying to lull the entire kingdom to sleep. The air carries that powdery sun-baked scent of papyrus and red, with just the faintest whisper of lotus flowers drifting down from somewhere upstream. You're in ancient Egypt, though not the one with dramatic pharaoh coronations or blockbuster chariot chases. No, this is the Egypt of errands, of gentle gossip under shade awnings, of priests muttering quietly to themselves about the state of fish markets. Somewhere behind you, a wooden cart groans as it's pulled over dusty stone. The wheels sound like they'd rather not be wheels anymore. You probably won't make it through this day, at least, not without wanting a nap. Before we wander any further, a gentle reminder: if you find yourself sinking into this little river of words, drifting towards sleep, you might like to subscribe. It's a quiet sort of commitment, like promising to meet someone for tea and actually showing up. If you feel inclined, leave a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is right now. It's oddly comforting to know someone might be listening from a rainy kitchen in Denmark or a lamplit bedroom in Manila. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You step off the packed earth path and into the shadow of the temple walls. Carved with more scenes than you could ever memorize, ships with sails like folded linen, farmers bent over their fields, and, curiously, no fish. Not a single fish. You glance at a priest passing by, his linen robe pristine despite the dust, and notice how he deftly avoids the market stall where today's catch glistens under the sun. He walks as if the fish aren't even there, which is a little suspicious for a city built along a river. The official temple truth is that fish are unclean. Not just wash it twice before you eat unclean, but don't let it touch your soul unclean. The priests whisper about decay and impurity, about how the gods prefer offerings that don't smell like yesterday's laundry water. Of course, some historians still debate whether this was a purely religious ban, or whether priests just really didn't like the taste. Over by the market, you overhear two fishmongers arguing about the best way to keep their goods fresh in the Egyptian sun, which is a bit like arguing about the best way to keep an ice cube in your pocket all afternoon. They glance at the temple walls and lower their voices, as if the gods themselves might overhear their sales pitch. A faint breeze brushes your cheek, warm and almost buttery in its softness. You follow the scent of baked bread from a stall ahead, because if the priests won't eat fish, they certainly have no issue with warm flatbread and honey. Someone offers you a small cup of barley beer, cloudy, slightly sour, the kind of drink that makes you want to sit down on the nearest step and contemplate the river's pace for a good hour. The Nile hums quietly in the background. Somewhere, a heron lifts off, wings slow and deliberate, as if it too has all day. You're standing now in the cool dimness of the temple courtyard, the heat of the outside world held at bay by thick limestone walls. The air smells faintly of incensoriousness, sweet, and with the barest undertone of something leafy, maybe imported myrrh from Punt. A group of priests shuffle past, their feet whispering against the stone like a chorus of sighs. You notice their shaved heads catching the afternoon light, smooth and pale compared to the sun-darkened workers outside. One of them pauses to adjust a papyrus scroll under his arm. He doesn't look at you, he's far too focused on his route, which seems to be a direct line that carefully skirts the small fountain at the courtyard's center. In that fountain, as if to mock the temple rules, two small tilapia flash in the shallow water. The priests don't acknowledge them. It's almost impressive, like pretending not to see your neighbor's terrible new haircut. A scribe, seated in the corner, dips his reed pen into ink and scribbles a line that you can't quite read from here. If you were closer, you might learn it's a temple record of offerings: dried figs, honey jars, fine linen, ever a single fish listed. The entries are neat and deliberate, each hieroglyph a miniature work of art. He looks up briefly, squints at the sunlight spilling in from the courtyard gate, and returns to his work. Here's the strange thing. While priests avoid fish, the regular folks along the Nile are frying, drying, and fermenting it with cheerful enthusiasm. A fisherman's wife you passed earlier was hanging strips of dried mullet like laundry in the sun, their scales catching little sparks of light. The smell pungent, yes, but not entirely unpleasant, lingered in the air like a stubborn memory. Historians still puzzle over the origins of this divide. Was it rooted in an ancient myth about fish devouring a god's body part? Or perhaps a symbolic avoidance, fish being creatures of the Nile's muddy underworld? Or maybe it's as simple as this: the priests had access to better food, and fish just didn't make the cut. You drift toward a shaded alcove where a young acolyte is crushing herbs with a mortar and pestle. The rhythmic scrape is oddly soothing. He pauses, wipes his hands, and begins to tell you completely unprompted about the temple's current project, painting the inner sanctuary's ceiling with constellations. You nod politely, thinking about how, even in a place where fish are banished, the stars are always welcome. From here, you can hear the muffled life of the streets outside, vendors calling out prices, a donkey braying in disapproval at something unseen, the occasional splash from the riverbank. The temple walls filter it all into a kind of soft, drowsy murmur, like a lullaby sung by a city that's been doing this for centuries. A fly drifts lazily in a sunbeam, its flight path making as little sense as your decision to follow a story about priests and fish. But here you are. The acolyte hums under his breath as he returns to his grinding, the sound like sand slipping through an hourglass. You feel the pull of the outer world again, remembering that street you walked past earlier, the one with the bread stall. It's still there, and the thought of warm honeyed bread makes the Nile seem even slower. And so you step back into the light, the courtyard shrinking behind you, the scent of incense clinging to your clothes like a quiet reminder that fish, here at least, are more trouble than they're worth. The sunlight feels a little brighter after the cool shadows of the temple, as if the outside world has been holding its breath just for you. The river glints like polished copper, and the air carries the mingled scents of damp clay jars, cumin seeds, and something faintly briny drifting from the docks. You wander toward the waterfront, where the rhythm of life is slower than the current itself. A fisherman sits cross-legged on the planks, mending his nets with a patience you could only dream of. The fibers are coarse, the knots neat and deliberate, each one a quiet act of faith that the Nile will continue to give. He doesn't look up, but you hear him mutter to a boy beside him something about how the priests wouldn't touch a tilapia if it jumped straight into their offering bowls. The boy laughs in that quick, bright way children do when they've learned something mildly scandalous. Here's a fact worth tucking away. In certain nomes, or provinces, the ancient Egyptians worshipped fish as sacred creatures, even giving them small ceremonial burials. You imagine tiny sarcophagi carved from wood, little painted eyes staring up at the eternity of the afterlife. But here in this city, the temple's view windsfish are kept at a respectful, and sometimes resentful, distance. Historians still debate whether this was a case of theological rivalry or just another example of how human beings can never quite agree on anything. You lean against a weathered post and watch as bundles of papyrus are loaded onto a boat. The sound of reeds brushing together in the breeze is soft and dry, like someone flipping through the pages of a book you're not supposed to read yet. A merchant nearby offers you a fig, its skin warm from the sun, the inside sweet and grainy. He shrugs when you ask about fish, saying only that the gods have their reasons, before returning to haggling over a jar of sesame oil. The longer you stand here, the more the world blurs into a rhythm, the slap of water against the hull, the distant clang of a pot from the street, the low hum of conversation in a language that wraps around your ears like a shawl. It's all so slow, so deliberate, as though time itself is in no rush to be anywhere else. And then, just at the edge of the dock, you see Ita, small wooden bowl floating in the shallows, holding 3 tiny fish. No one claims it, no one even looks at it. You wonder if it's an offering that didn't make it past the temple gates, or simply someone's abandoned lunch. Either way, it bobs quietly in the ripples, perfectly ignored. You take the long way back, toward the market, meandering down a narrow lane that smells faintly of baking clay. The houses here are close set, their mud brick walls leaning toward each other, as if exchanging secrets overhead. Laundry flutters between them, strips of linen and cotton catching the sun like sails. Somewhere, a cat slips past with the effortless arrogance of a creature who knows it's sacred in half the city and merely tolerated in the rest. In a shaded doorway, an elderly woman is pounding something in a wooden mortar, garlic, maybe, or coriander seeds. She glances up, eyes crinkling, and offers you a seat on a low stool. You accept, and she begins to talk without any expectation of response. Her story meanders like the river. A neighbor's son has grown tall. Her cousin's goat has learned to open baskets. And here's the interesting part. Her late husband once delivered fish to the temple kitchens by mistake. They made him leave it outside, she says, shaking her head. Outside, in the sun. Can you imagine the smell? The truth is, temple purity laws weren't always convenient. When a festival called for a lavish feast, priests had to be careful with what crossed their threshold. Fish, being both common and, let's say, aromatic, simply didn't fit the bill. Some scholars think this rule came from an old myth about the god Osiris, whose body was scattered in the Nile, where certain fish species might have nibbled on him. Whether or not that's true, the story stuck like fish smell tends to pick it. From where you sit, you can hear the muffled chatter of the market returning. It's that same bread stall again, remember? The one you passed before entering the temple. The smell is stronger now. The crusts blistered from the oven, the honey glistening like amber in the afternoon sun. The woman beside you hums softly as she finishes her work, her mortar thumping a slow, steady beat. You thank her and step back into the lane, where the breeze carries a mix of spice, dust, and the faintest hint of river mud. Somewhere far off, a temple bell chimes a hollow, bronze reminder that the priests are still inside, tending to their rituals, carefully keeping the Nile's fish at a ceremonial arm's length. And as you walk toward the market, you realize the city has a rhythm all its own, a sleepy sway between devotion and daily life. Between the temple's rules and the river's gifts, the market greets you like an old friend who's been busy but still happy to see you. The air is thicker here, heavy with the scent of cumin, fresh dates, and the occasional whiff of goat. You drift past stalls draped with linen dyed in sun-faded blues and reds, past baskets stacked with onions whose papery skins crackle softly when the wind touches them. You pause at a pottery vendor's table, where rows of amphiri stand like an audience awaiting a performance. The vendor is explaining to a customer quite passionately that his jars will keep wine cooler than any other, even in the dead of summer. His voice is calm but carries that unshakable confidence usually reserved for people selling kitchen gadgets on late-night television. It's here, between a spice merchant and a man selling carved ivory combs, that you hear it again, the fish debate. Two men, leaning over a crate of dried mullet, are arguing about whether priests secretly eat fish in private. One insists it's impossible, that the gods would see. The other leans closer, lowering his voice, claiming he once saw a priest at a festival accidentally accept a plate of grilled perch and not send it back. Historians, of course, can't prove anything like that, though you suspect gossip in this city ages better than papyrus. You edge past, the stall's shadows giving way to another burst of sunlight. A boy runs by carrying a clay jug half his size, sloshing water down the dusty path in his hurry. From somewhere nearby comes the cheerful clink of metal scales, weighing coriander seeds. The market is alive, but not in a hurried waltz, the kind of place where you could spend an entire afternoon watching people decide between two equally identical loaves of bread. And there, at the far end, you see it again, the bread stall. The baker smiles at you this time, as if recognizing a fellow creature in search of warmth and sugar. He hands you a small piece without asking for coin, a quiet blessing, perhaps for simply existing in his corner of the world. The bread is warm, soft in the center, and just sticky enough from honey to make you consider staying here forever. You find yourself walking toward the riverbank again, the bread still in your hand, the city's sounds blurring into a background hum. The Nile, unbothered by the day's business, continues its unhurried journey. Boats with sails like folded parchment glide past, their hulls heavy with baskets of grain, bundles of reeds, and, yes, crates of fish. A fisherman sitting cross-legged on the bank notices you looking and gestures toward one of his catches, a catfish, its whiskers twitching faintly in the air. "They won't touch it in the temple," he says with a half smile, "but it feeds my family." His voice is simple, without bitterness, just stating a fact of life. It's worth noting that certain fish species in the Nile were seen as more problematic than others. Catfish, in particular, were often avoided in temple contexts, perhaps because they lived at the bottom of the river, stirring up mud and mystery. Scholars still debate whether this was due to symbolic associations with chaos, or just a practical aversion to their taste. Behind you, children chase each other along the bank, their laughter bright against the steady hush of the water. One of them holds a small clay toy boat, chipped but still seaworthy in the shallow pools at the edge. They let it go, and it bobs gently before catching a tiny current. A heron stands nearby, head tilted, watching the fish in the shallows with a kind of patience only nature truly masters. You imagine it has no opinions on temple dietary rules, only on whether dinner will swim close enough. You sit down on a low stone wall, tearing off another piece of bread, letting the crumbs fall for the birds. The warm air wraps around you, and the river's endless movement begins to feel like breathing, steady, deep, unhurried. Somewhere upriver, a temple bell tolls again, a soft bronze note carried on the breeze. It's a reminder that the priests are still in their cool courtyards, incense curling in the air, their kitchens conspicuously free of fish. And here you are, between two worlds, the sacred and the everyday, listening to the river's quiet insistence that both are part of the same story. The path along the river curves toward a small grove of date palms, their fronds swaying lazily, casting patchy shadows that drift across your feet. The heat softens here, replaced by the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig as a lizard scurries out of sight. A man in a faded linen tunic sits under one of the trees, weaving a basket with practiced ease. His hands move almost without thought, fingers dancing between reeds, twisting and tucking them into shape. He glances up at you and nods in greeting before returning to his work. Beside him is a clay jar with its lid askew, revealing a glistening heap of dried dates. The smell is sweet, rich, and faintly caramel-like, a kind of natural perfume that would make even the most devout priest reconsider fasting. You sit nearby, and he begins to speak in that gentle, slow way that suggests his stories are meant to fill the space between breaths rather than demand attention. He tells you about a time, many years ago, when a group of traveling priests camped near this grove during a flood season. They brought their own food, bread, beer, onions, but refused the fisherman's generous offer of smoked tilapia. They said it was for purity, he recalls with a shrug, but I think they just didn't want to share the beer. The sun slips lower, turning the river's surface into a long ribbon of copper and gold. In the distance, a small boat glides toward the docks, its single sail catching the last of the afternoon wind. You hear laughter from the decksman telling a joke loud enough for the shoreline to catch the echo. Historians still argue about whether the priestly fish ban was a uniform law across Egypt or a custom observed only in certain temple orders. Evidence suggests it varied by region, much like the way bread recipes change from one village to the next. It's one of those details that resists neat answers, like the river's own shifting moods. A breeze brushes your cheek, bringing with it the scent of distant cooking fires. You stand, brushing the dust from your robe, and thank the basket weaver for the company. He nods without pausing in his work, his hands already shaping the next reed into place. You follow the narrowing path into a cluster of low mud brick homes that seem almost grown from the earth itself. Their walls are smooth and pale, with doorways shaded by woven mats. A group of women sit in a circle outside one house, their fingers busy with spindle whorls, drawing out threads of flax. The rhythmic spin and pull creates a faint whisper in the warm air, almost like the distant hush of waves. One of them looks up and offers you a seat. A clay cup of cool water is pressed into your hand, the rim smooth from years of use. They begin talking about family, the weather, the price of barley, but eventually the conversation drifts toward the temple. Apparently, one of the women's cousins works in the outer kitchens, where meals for the priests are prepared. They won't even let fish past the gates, she says, shaking her head with mock disbelief. We have to cook it outside if it's for the workers. Can you imagine? The smell probably wouldn't last 10 steps, but they won't risk it. She laughs softly, the sound mingling with the hum of spinning flax. Here's the curious thing. In Egyptian art, fish are sometimes painted with exquisite detail, carefully etched, the colors vivid. It's as if they were admired visually but shunned physically. Like those expensive throw pillows no one's allowed to actually lean on. Scholars still debate whether this visual appreciation was symbolic or simply decorative, a nod to the Nile's abundance without crossing ritual boundaries. From your seat, you can see children playing at the edge of the lane, their bare feet kicking up little clouds of dust. They've made a game of drawing fish in the dirt with sticks, then erasing them with their toes. No one tells them to stop. No one seems to mind. As the sun leans toward the horizon, the air takes on that familiar golden haze, softening every edge. Someone brings out a small plate of figs and bread, and the conversation slows to a contented murmur. You take another sip of water, feeling the day loosen its grip on you, as if the city itself is exhaling. In the quiet, you realize the priest's fish rule might not matter much to anyone outside the temple walls. Life here keeps flowing like the river, like the spinning thread regardless. The lane opens onto a small square, where the day's bustle has begun to melt into the slow hum of evening. A potter's wheel turns lazily in one corner, the artisan's hands coaxing a shapeless lump of clay into a jar that will probably hold lentils or beer by next season. The rhythmic squish of wet clay is strangely satisfying, like the sound of kneading bread, only with fewer snacks at the end. Across the square, a storyteller has gathered a few listeners. He's perched on a low stool, his voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the crowd. You drift closer, catching the thread of his tale mid-sentence. It's about a time long ago when a certain priest whose name he repeats often, as if daring you to remember, was stranded on a small island during a storm. For days, the only food available was fish from the surrounding shallows. The storyteller pauses, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. And yet, he would rather starve than take a single bite. The crowd murmurs, a few shaking their heads, as though this level of devotion is admirable, but also slightly absurd. The man next to you leans in. Some say the gods test their servants with temptation. Others say he just couldn't cook. Historians still puzzle over where devotion ends and practicality begins. Perhaps both explanations are true, or perhaps neither. As the story wraps up, the crowd begins to disperse, drawn toward the smells drifting from nearby homes. You follow, noting how the square's stone floor holds the day's warmth under your sandals. Someone has set out a small clay lamp, its flame flickering in the breeze, casting a golden glow that seems to pull shadows closer. A thin cat winds between your legs, its purr more vibration than sound. It follows you for a few steps, then veers off toward a group of women shelling beans. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the muffled beat of a drum's low, measured, like a heartbeat stretched over miles. The Nile is just beyond this square, you realize. You can smell it now, water and silt, mingled with the faint sweetness of blooming papyrus. That scent is the kind of thing that stays with you, even after you've gone. You take a narrow alley that slopes gently downward, the walls close enough to brush your fingertips on either side. At the end, the alley spills into a small riverside garden, a pocket of green framed by reeds and low stone walls. Someone has planted herbs here, coriander, mint, a few tufts of garlic. The air is cooler, and the chatter of the market feels far away. A man in a simple white kilt tends to the plants, plucking leaves and dropping them into a basket. He greets you with a nod, then gestures toward a bench shaded by a fig tree. You sit, the wood smooth and worn from years of use. He explains that the garden belongs to the temple, but is tended outside its walls. Partly, because certain plants like garlic aren't considered suitable for priestly diets either. Apparently, the gods have a very particular menu. When you ask about fish, he smiles knowingly. We grow herbs for everyone, he says, but the fish are for those who need them. He points toward the river, where two boys are pulling in a net, heavy with their catch. The man's tone is gentle, as though this division of food is just another natural current in life. Here's a strange tidbit. While fish were banned in many temple contexts, they were sometimes used in festivals, either as offerings to certain deities or as symbolic items in processions. Scholars still debate the contradictions, noting that ancient religion was rarely as neat and orderly as the carved reliefs suggest. The gardener offers you a sprig of mint, the scent bright and cooling in your hand. The breeze carries it toward the water, where the boys are now laughing as they sort their catch, some for dinner, some to dry for later. You watch as the fish scales flash briefly in the fading light, each one a tiny reflection of the setting sun. The man returns to his work, and you sit a moment longer, feeling the stillness settle in. The river seems quieter now, the day's clamor giving way to the slow exhale of evening. Somewhere upriver, you hear the faint clang of the temple bell, again a reminder that the rules, like the tide, keep their own steady rhythm. Evening lays itself gently over the city, turning the limestone walls a soft rose gold before letting them sink into shadow. You follow a wide street back toward the temple quarter, though now it feels entirely different than it did under the morning sun. The air is cooler, the voice is lower, the pace unhurried to the point of stillness. Small oil lamps flicker in doorways, their flames bowing in the occasional breeze. You pass a man carrying a basket of onions on his shoulder, the smell trailing after him like a stubborn companion. Ahead, a group of children play a game in the dust, drawing shapes with sticks, birds, stars, and, occasionally, fish. The fish drawings make you smile, because here they seem like a harmless doodle, rather than a religious controversy. Near the temple gates, a pair of priests stand talking in quiet tones. Their robes catch the lamplight, turning into pale ghosts against the dark. You can't hear their words, but you notice one of them holds a small clay jar. He gestures toward the river, then back toward the temple kitchens. Perhaps they're discussing the next day's offerings, or perhaps just the best route to avoid the fishmongers on the quay. Here's something worth remembering. In some regions of Egypt, certain fish were believed to embody gods themselves, and eating them was unthinkable. In others, the same species might be a festival delicacy. Historians still scratch their heads over how these overlapping beliefs coexisted without more public arguments. Then again, perhaps people simply knew when to disagree. Quietly, a breeze carries the faint scent of incense from within the temple walls, warm, resinous, and edged with something floral. You stand a moment, watching the gate as it swallows the priests into shadow, and wonder whether the Nile's fish know their part of such elaborate human rules. Probably not. Fish, as a rule, don't keep track of temple law. You turn away. The street now a soft corridor of night sounds, sandals scuffing over stone, the distant splash of oars, the muted hum of people preparing for rest. The path takes you past the baker's stall again, though now the counter is bare, the ovens cooling under the night sky. The smell of bread lingers in the air, warm and ghostly, as if the loaves themselves are still around somewhere, whispering about the day's customers. You wander toward a quieter part of town, where the streets widen just enough to let the starlight in. Above you, the constellations have begun to appear, familiar patterns to the ancient Egyptians, each one tied to stories and seasonal rhythms. Somewhere inside the temple, a ceiling is being painted with those same stars, an eternal sky for the gods to gaze upon. In a small courtyard, an elderly man sits on a stool repairing a fishing net by lamplight. The glow softens his face into lines of patience. He nods to you but doesn't stop working, his fingers slipping the cord through each loop with the care of someone who knows that every knot matters. When you ask about the priest's aversion to fish, he chuckles. "Ah, the fish and the priests," he says. "Two things that never meet except in stories." He tells you about a local saying. The fish swims past the temple without looking. It means some things, no matter how close they come, are simply meant to pass by untouched. Scholars have no written record of this phrase, but sayings often live longer in memory than in ink. The man lifts his net to inspect it, and for a moment it catches the starlight, each knot glowing faintly before he lets it fall again. You thank him, and he waves you off with the quiet finality of someone returning to his work. The night air has cooled enough to make you notice your skin, the warmth of the day replaced by something softer. The city's noise has dwindled to the occasional laugh from an open doorway, the murmur of voices behind mud-brick walls, and the gentle lapping of the Nile against its banks. You keep walking, the stars above and the river beside you, both moving in their own unhurried, unbothered way. The street bends toward the water again, opening into a small riverside plaza where lanterns bob gently from wooden posts. Their light trembles across the Nile, making the surface look like a piece of silk being slowly pulled through someone's fingers. A musician sits cross-legged near the edge, plucking at a long-necked lute. The notes are soft, hesitant at first, then settle into a slow, repetitive pattern that seems designed less for performance and more for coaxing the air into calmness. You sit on a low step, the stone still faintly warm from the day, and let the music wash over you. Beside you, a young woman is laying out small clay figurines on a cloth. They're shaped like fish, tilapia, catfish, petrel painted in muted colors. You ask if she sells them as toys. She smiles and shakes her head. "For good luck," she says. "Some take them on journeys. Others keep them by the door." The irony isn't lost on you. In a city where priests forbid fish from crossing the temple threshold, here they're shaped in clay and cherished as charms. Historians still puzzle over such contradictions, but perhaps that's because they keep looking for one single truth, instead of accepting a collection of smaller, overlapping ones. A barge drifts past, its crew silent, the sail catching a low breath of wind. The music continues, the same slow refrain, like a lullaby for the river itself. You lean back, staring up at the stars, and wonder how many nights have looked exactly like this. Lamps on the bank, music in the air, the Nile carrying both fish and stories downstream. The plaza smells faintly of grilled bread and mint. Somewhere nearby, someone laughs, the sound curling into the music, as if it's always been part of the song. You rise and follow the edge of the river, the lamps growing fewer until they're replaced entirely by moonlight. The water here is darker, quieter, the sound of its movement louder in the stillness. A small shrine sits just off the path, a squat structure of stone with a faded carving above the doorway. It's dedicated to a river deity, one who, according to local belief, sometimes takes the form of a fish. You step closer, tracing the weather-worn outline of scales along the carving. A small bowl sits at the base of the shrine, half filled with dried herbs and a single copper coin. No fish, fresh or otherwise. The air smells faintly of damp reed mats. You hear the soft flutter of wings as a night bird shifts its perch. The quiet is so complete that you can hear the faint slap of a fishtail somewhere out in the water, breaking the surface for just a moment before disappearing again. Here's the oddity. Even among communities that revered fish-shaped deities, there's evidence that priests still avoided eating the animal itself. Some scholars think this separation between symbol and substance was deliberate, a way to keep the divine representation pure. Others suggest it was just another example of religious compartmentalizing, a way to keep everyone happy while still following local traditions. You linger a little longer at the shrine, the moonlight turning the water into a shifting mirror. It's hard to tell where the river ends and the night begins. Somewhere in the distance, faint and far, you hear the low toll of the temple bell. It's slower now, each note hanging in the air long enough to dissolve into silence. You take it as a signal not to hurry, but to keep walking, to see where the path and the river will carry you next. The path bends once more, leading you back toward the outskirts of the sleeping city. Here, the houses are farther apart, their doorways dark, their courtyards silent, except for the occasional rustle of palm leaves in the night breeze. The Nile runs parallel to your steps, a steady, dark ribbon, carrying with it the quiet cargo of reflected stars. You pass a low wall where someone has left a shallow basket of bread, perhaps for a neighbor, perhaps for the gods, perhaps simply forgotten. The scent is faint now, mixed with the cooler air, but you catch a hint of honey that makes you think of the baker's warm smile earlier in the day. At the river's edge, a small wooden jetty juts out into the water. You walk to the end and sit, letting your feet dangle just above the surface. The current moves beneath you, smooth and indifferent, carrying fish past the city, past the temple, past all the places where rules try to divide the sacred from the ordinary. You remember the priest in the courtyard, ignoring the fountain's tilapia, the fisherman mending his nets at dawn, the children drawing fish in the dust, the clay charms in the plaza. They're all part of the same story, each with their own current, each finding a way to exist alongside the others without cancelling them out. Historians still debate the why of the priest's ban on fish, and perhaps they always will. But sitting here, listening to the night and the river speak in their patient, endless language, you suspect the answer might be less about doctrine and more about the peculiar ways people draw boundaries on, how those boundaries ripple out into daily life. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of damp reeds and something faintly floral from the far bank. The stars overhead seem sharper now, the constellations like tiny lamps, hung just for you. The river breathes beneath you, steady and unchanging, its voice a soft murmur that seeps into your bones. You let your eyes wander over the water's surface, tracing the gentle way it folds and unfolds, carrying its quiet cargo of light downstream. The air is cooler now, each breath slower than the last, as though the whole world has settled into the same deep rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, the faint note of a lute drifts on the wind, a single thread of music weaving into the sound of the water. You let it fade in and out, not trying to follow it, just letting it pass like a dream you don't need to remember. The city behind you is still. Lamps have burned low, doors are closed. Even the night birds seem to pause between calls, their wings tucked close in the moonlight. The air is still tonight, warm but with a kind of slow, lazy breeze that barely bothers the leaves overhead. You stand at the edge of a garden that isn't yours, but that's fine. Ownership is mostly a technicality here, and besides, the night watchman has already nodded off against the wall. Ahead, a low moon drapes everything in a gentle silver. and you can smell crushed jasmine somewhere out of sight. This is Agra, though the city's hum feels far away. You're in the 17th century, a time when the Mughal Empire is stretching its limbs across the subcontinent. Out here, past the formal courtyards, there's a more private world, the Emperor's Garden, a place where trees are not content to just stand there. They curl, they twist, they climb their own invisible staircases toward the sky. The gardeners call it Furna, the turning an art form in slow motion. You probably won't make it through this day though. In fairness, this day is about 400 years long. Still, before your eyes droop entirely, maybe press that like button so the YouTube algorithm doesn't spiral in the wrong direction. And if you're awake enough, comment your location and the exact local time. I'm curious to know where in the world you're leaning back right now. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey. You begin walking along a path made of pale sandstone. The stones are warm underfoot, having soaked up the day's heat, and the night air brushes against your skin like cool fabric. Fireflies hover lazily at ankle height, as if even they are unwilling to rush. The nearest tree is not straight at all. It tilts slightly, then bends, then arcs upward like a ribbon frozen in mid-dance. A young gardener, perhaps 12 years old, is crouched at its base, tying a thin length of cane around a supple branch. The cane curves, and the branch follows. The major fact here, though, he doesn't bother telling you, is that Mughal horticulturists practiced bending techniques, not unlike those used in bonsai, except on a scale grand enough to shade an emperor's picnic. Instead of trimming trees into tiny perfection, they guided them to grow in spirals, curls, and even loops. This wasn't just for beauty, it was a quiet boast, a demonstration that nature could be coaxed into patterns only patience could see through. As you pass him, the boy looks up with a grin, then glances toward a squat clay pot nearby. Inside, a single mango seed is nestled in damp soil. 5 years, he says, in a tone that implies you should probably start making long-term plans. There's an odd little tidbit you notice. Beside each spiraling tree stands a low terracotta jar, half buried in the earth. These are motkas, filled not with drinking water, but with diluted milk. The gardeners believe that feeding the roots with milk encourages the trees to grow calm and obedient. Whether that's true is questionable, but it certainly makes the local cats suspiciously affectionate toward the groves. Historians still debate whether this was a horticultural trick or just a bit of superstition that persisted because it sounded charming in poetry. You wander deeper. The trees here form what looks like a loose maze, each trunk coiling upward and outward, catching moonlight along its spiral ridges. Somewhere far off, a fountain murmurs, its sound softened by the night. You can't see it yet, but you feel its presence, a steady pulse of coolness in the air. Overhead, a night heron drifts past in slow, deliberate wing beats. Its shadow brushes the path in front of you, and for a second you feel as though you've stepped through a living curtain into an even quieter space. By now, the sounds of the city have faded into nothing but memory. The only noises are the slow creak of branches shifting in the breeze, and the occasional clink of a gardener's tools. You pass a tree whose trunk twists so tightly it looks like two serpents entwined. At its base, a small clay tablet is propped against the roots. It bears a line of Persian poetry. When you turn, the world turns with you. You keep walking. Somewhere behind you, the boy laughs quietly at something you'll never know, and the path begins to narrow. The air smells faintly of wet earth and citrus leaves. Ahead, the shadows deepen, and the spirals grow tighter. The path takes you under an archway made of interlaced branches. It's deliberate. You can see where the bark has fused, where two saplings once leaned toward each other, tied year after year, until they became a single, breathing arch. It frames the night sky in a way that feels almost staged. You step through, and the garden changes. Here, the ground is softer, the soil damp from recent watering. Your sandals sink slightly, making each step muffled, as if you're walking in the quiet aisle of an ancient library. Fireflies still linger, but they seem fewer here, as though this is a section reserved for serious contemplation. A man in a loose cotton robe kneels beside one of the spiraling trees. He's older, his beard streaked with silver, his movements slow but precise. He's winding a strip of silk dyed a deep indigo on a branch, coaxing it into a gentle turn. You pause, watching, and he looks up without surprise. Trees, he says, must learn patience from us, and we must learn patience from them. The major fact he could tell you, if pressed, is that under Emperor Shah Jahan, the same man who commissioned the Taj Mahal. Gardens were designed as metaphors for paradise, each element symbolic. The spiraled trees represented the soul's journey, not in a straight line, but in a graceful, upward coil toward enlightenment. This was not gardening. This was philosophy with roots and leaves. He stands and gestures for you to follow him. As you walk, he points to a slender tree with bark so pale it almost glows. That one, he says, we trained to spiral to the left, against the sun. You ask why. He smiles faintly. So it will surprise the sun each morning. Whether that's true horticulture or just poetic stubbornness, you can't quite decide. Historians still argue whether certain spiral directions had practical irrigation benefits or were purely symbolic. Most agree it's one of those things you can debate forever over tea. There's a curious little detail you notice. At the base of each tree is a ring of tiny clay figurines, no taller than your thumb. Some are shaped like elephants, others like dancers, a few like faceless human forms in prayer. The gardener explains these are raksha charms meant to protect the trees from evil spirits, and, presumably, from goats with a taste for bark. The two of you arrive at a small stone bench half hidden beneath the branches of a spiraling neem tree. Its trunk curves twice before rising straight, giving it the look of a frozen wave. The gardener sits, pats the stone beside him. You sit too. From here, you can see the faint glow of lanterns along the garden's far wall. The light catches the edges of the leaves, making them shimmer. Somewhere nearby, water trickles over stone, a small channel running between the tree roots. You trail your fingers in it as it passes, cool and clean. The man tells you that each spiral tree has a keeper, someone who tends it for life. Apprentices start as children, tying and guiding branches, and grow old alongside the trees. By the time a tree has reached its full form, its perfect spiral, the gardener is usually gray-haired, if not gone. The work is a gift to the future, he says. The tree doesn't need to thank you. It thanks the people who will walk beneath it long after you're gone. Somewhere behind you, a night breeze stirs the leaves. It carries the scent of marigolds and the faintest hint of smoke from the city beyond. You look up. The stars seem sharper now, framed in the soft black spirals of the branches overhead. You remember the boy from earlier, his grin, his mango seed in its clay pot. Maybe one day, that seed will spiral too. The gardener rises, brushes dust from his robe, and nods for you to continue along the path. The trees here lean in close, their spirals almost brushing your shoulders. The air feels thicker, like stepping into the inside of a seashell. Ahead, you see another arch, this one even more tightly woven, its leaves whispering secrets you'll have to pretend not to overhear. You step forward, the ground cool beneath your feet, the garden curling inward, drawing you deeper into its patient, spiraling heart. The next archway bends so tightly, it feels like a door into a different season. You step through, and the air shifts warmer now, but drier, touched with the faint sweet dust of crushed petals. The light here is softer, the moon blurred behind a haze. Somewhere far above, an owl sighs, the way only an owl can, as though unimpressed by your progress. You're on a narrower path now, this one lined with low hedges that look freshly clipped. Though you haven't seen a single hedge clipper, the hedge itself isn't straight, it curls and loops, tracing gentle waves, as though competing with the trees for grace. A few steps in, you realize something strange. Every hedge curve mirrors the spiral of the nearest tree. Coincidence? The gardeners here don't seem to believe in coincidence. A young woman in a pale green tunic is crouched by the path, sorting through a shallow basket of stones. She examines each one carefully, turning it over before either placing it back or setting it in a circle at the base of a sapling. You pause, curious, and she glances up. Stones shape matters, she says in a tone that implies you should already know this. Round stones make round branches. Whether this is botany or poetry is unclear, but she seems perfectly certain. Historians still debate whether such placement had any measurable effect, or was simply a gardener's superstition passed down like a family recipe. Your major fact here is less whimsical. Under Mughal rule, gardens were carefully divided into quadrants or patterned sections, each with its own plant species, water source, and caretaker. These spiral groves would have been the more experimental zone, where gardeners could try novel techniques away from the formal symmetry expected of the emperor's public spaces. This was the empire's quiet laboratory for living sculpture. You watch the woman place a perfectly oval stone beside a young tamarind, tucking it gently into the soil like a sleeping pet. Then she straightens and dusts her hands. "The trees know when you hurry," she says with a half smile. "That's why they take so long." It's not an accusation, exactly, but it does make you slow your step. Further ahead, you notice a low wooden frame built around a sapling. Thin ropes hang from it, tied to the young branches in a way that makes them lean gently, like dancers practicing a slow-motion bow. It looks fragile, but you suspect these supports are checked daily, adjusted by hands that know exactly how far a branch will tolerate persuasion before it protests. There's another curious touch here. Every tree wears a strip of cloth tied around its trunk, the color varying from tree to tree: saffron, crimson, indigo, white. The woman tells you these are rangbands, color ties, each signaling the tree's stage of training. Red means the spiral is still forming. Indigo means the branch is nearly set. White means the tree has reached its final curve and is simply being tended. She doesn't explain what saffron means. You don't ask. The path curves sharply, taking you past a shallow, reflecting pool. The water is so still it seems not to exist until the breeze catches it, scattering tiny ripples across the moon's reflection. The trees around it lean inward, their spirals meeting above the pool like the inner ridges of a great seashell. You lean closer, and for a moment, your own reflection coils in the water, distorted by the curves above. Behind you, the sound of stone tapping stone drifts faintly from where the woman still works. Ahead, the air smells faintly of something sharp and citrusy, and you find yourself walking toward it, without quite meaning to. The citrus scent thickens as the path opens into a grove of lime and bitter orange trees. Their spirals are tighter here, each turn more deliberate, as though the branches are winding themselves around some invisible pole. The fruits hang low, pale green and orange-yellow in the moonlight, their skins dimpled and cool. A pair of gardeners are working quietly among them. One is winding a thin copper wire around a branch knot to bind it tightly, but to create a subtle weight. The other is brushing the leaves with something that glints faintly in the light. You move closer and see it's a slurry of ash and water. They nod politely but keep working, their focus so steady it feels almost ceremonial. The major fact here is practical. Copper was often used in ancient horticulture for its resistance to rot and its mild antifungal properties. In the Mughal gardens, fine copper wires doubled as both a shaping tool and a health precaution, discouraging certain pests without the need for more drastic measures. The ash slurry, too, was more than aesthetic. It deterred leaf-eating insects and reflected harsh sunlight. As for the odd cultural tidbit, there's a small clay bowl hanging from one of the branches, filled with slices of roasted eggplant. You glance at it, puzzled, until one gardener murmurs that roasted eggplant calms the tree's temper. You can't tell if he's joking, but his expression is dead serious. Historians, for their part, have never agreed on whether this was a symbolic offering to spirits or simply a snack the gardener set down and forgot. The trees here are older than most you've seen tonight. Their spirals fully formed, their bark weathered into deep grooves that catch shadow like water in stone. Some spiral clockwise, others counterclockwise, and you start to wonder if the direction is intentional. The gardeners seem to move differently around each type, stepping inside the curl for one, staying outside for another, as though respecting some unwritten etiquette. In the center of the grove stands a single tree that breaks the pattern entirely. It is straight, rigid, unbent, its trunk rising like a column toward the night. At its base lies a scattering of copper wire, old and green with age. A faded white cloth is tied around it. You pause before it, and one gardener joins you. "Some trees," he says, "refuse." There's no bitterness in his voice, if anything, a hint of admiration. The air in the grove feels denser, scented with fruit and something like warm stone. You hear the slow drip of water somewhere nearby, though you can't find the source. The gardeners continue their quiet work, weaving the copper in and out, brushing leaves with ash, adjusting ropes by increments, so small they seem invisible. When you finally step out of the grove, you carry the smell of citrus with you. It clings to your sleeves, your hair, the soft skin of your palms. The path ahead is darker now, leading toward what looks like a cluster of low pavilions, their rooftops peaking above the hedge line. The spirals aren't visible here, but you can feel them behind you, winding, tightening, holding their shapes against the pull of time. You follow the narrowing path until the ground changes beneath your feet, from loose, fragrant soil to cool stone, smooth and faintly damp. The moonlight here is broken into fragments by the latticework of an open pavilion wall. You step inside, and the night air shifts again still, but somehow lighter, as if the structure itself breathes in long, slow intervals. The pavilion is empty, except for a few low cushions and a carved wooden table with a single brass lantern on top. Its light doesn't compete with the moon. It simply adds a warm amber note to the silver already pooling around you. Beyond the open archways, you see the trees again spiral still, but farther apart, each one with space enough to stretch its curves in all directions. Leaning against a pillar, an elderly man with a thin white beard watches you with mild curiosity. He wears a loose robe, the color of faded rose petals, and a shawl draped over one shoulder. "You've walked the lower groves," he says in a voice that creaks like a well-oiled door. "Up here, the spirals are for thinking." The major fact he offers, without quite saying it directly, is that Mughal gardens were more than decoration. They were spaces for governance and diplomacy. Treaties could be discussed under these very arches, with spiraled trees as a backdrop, a subtle reminder of patience and deliberate growth. An impatient negotiator might be invited to stroll here, the paths winding enough to slow his temper. You notice a curious detail on the pavilion floor. Small mosaic tiles, each shaped like a leaf, arranged in long winding lines that coil toward the center of the space. The man tells you they map the actual spirals of trees in the garden below. Visitors could follow the patterns with their eyes while sipping tea, tracing the living forms without leaving their cushions. Historians still debate whether these maps were meant for relaxation or to impress guests with the empire's horticultural skill, though both seem likely. A light breeze moves through the pavilion, brushing your cheek with the scent of cardamom. Somewhere nearby, unseen hands are grinding spices, the sound rhythmic and unhurried. The man gestures toward a small wooden box beside him. Inside are thin strips of bark, each coiled tightly like a miniature version of the trees outside. "Practice pieces," he says, almost smiling, "for young gardeners who need to learn the curve before they touch the living wood." He doesn't ask if you want to try, but you find your fingers tracing the cool, smooth surface of one coil, feeling its spiral soften slightly in your hand. Outside, a nightjar calls, its voice low and repetitive, like a line of thought circling back to itself. When you leave the pavilion, you step into a long colonnade lined with narrow windows. The moonlight here comes in stripes, banding the path in alternating shadow and glow. Somewhere ahead, you can hear the soft rush of water, again closer now, more insistent. The colonnade opens onto a terrace, and suddenly the sound of water becomes the main voice in the night. Before you stretches a long, shallow canal, its surface broken by slow-moving ripples that catch both moon and lantern light. On either side, the terrace is edged by low walls, and just beyond them, rows of spiraled trees lean over the water, as if whispering to their own reflections. The air here is cooler, touched with the scent of damp stone and crushed mint. A young man in a neatly wrapped turban kneels by the canal, adjusting small clay channels that divert the water toward the base of certain trees. He works silently, with the precision of someone tuning a delicate instrument. Your major fact for this place: Mughal gardens relied on elaborate water management systems, often fed by aqueducts from miles away. Water was not just for irrigation, it was symbolic of life and paradise itself. In spiral groves, water channels sometimes followed gentle curves rather than straight lines, mirroring the tree's form and slowing the flow to encourage deeper soil absorption. There's an unusual tidbit here. You notice the young man placing small, polished river stones into the water channels, just upstream from the trees. He explains that the sound of water over stones keeps the trees awake at night, so they remember to grow. Whether that's horticultural truth or just a gardener's bedtime story for plants, he doesn't say. Historians remain divided on whether sound-based tree training was ever more than poetic metaphor, though they agree it made the gardens feel alive. The terrace wall is carved with repeating spiral motifs, the stone worn smooth where countless hands have touched it. You rest your palm there, feeling the faint chill of centuries-old sandstone. Beyond the canal, the moonlight catches something unusual: one tree whose spiral seems to collapse inward, like a seashell curling to its core. You walk over, careful on the damp stone, and find that the branches twist so tightly they nearly touch in the center. A garland of fresh marigolds hangs there, glowing faintly in the night. The young man joins you, carrying a clay jug. He pours a thin stream of water at the base of the tree. The sound a soft hiss against the soil. This one's spiral, he says, is a prayer. You don't ask for what, some things are better left, spiraling quietly in the dark. The terrace ends in a small flight of steps, leading back down toward the garden floor. As you descend, the sound of the canal fades, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the slow chorus of crickets. The path here is unpaved again, the soil springy underfoot, and the spirals ahead loom larger, their curves catching the moonlight in ways that make them seem almost in motion. The soil here is darker, richer, almost black in the moonlight. You can smell it before you see it, earth, deepened by years of compost, fallen leaves, and something faintly sweet, like overripe figs. The path curves left, then right, as if imitating the very trees it winds between. You pass a spiraled fig tree whose branches form a loose helix around an empty space, like a corkscrew holding a pocket of air. Inside that hollow, someone has placed a clay lamp, its flame steady and small. The light makes the inner bark glow as if the tree is lit from within. You pause, and a voice behind you says, "For the moths." You turn to see a gardener barefoot, a coil of jute rope slung over one shoulder, watching you with mild amusement. They follow the light, not the leaves. Saves us a few bites. Here's your major fact. The Mughal gardens often integrated pest control into aesthetic design. Lamps, scented flowers, even small channels of running water doubled as deterrents for insects, birds, or grazing animals. It wasn't purely practical, though these solutions were chosen as much for beauty as for function. An early form of what we might now call integrated garden design. The odd little tidbit here is stranger still. You notice a row of shallow clay bowls half buried along the path, each filled with a thin layer of rosewater. The gardener explains that these are moon mirrors for the trees, reflecting light onto the lower branches so they won't feel neglected at night. Whether that's horticulture or the 17th century equivalent of mood lighting, you can't quite decide. Historians, for their part, argue endlessly about whether moonlight had any influence on plant growth, or if this was simply a poetic indulgence by wealthy patrons. You follow the gardener deeper into the grove, your feet sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air grows warmer, the scents heavier: ripe figs, bruised leaves, damp rope. The spirals here are wider, more relaxed, like dancers leaning back after a long performance. You reach out to touch one, the bark warm from the day's sun, and feel the faint throb of sap beneath your fingertips. The gardener crouches by a young sapling, tying one of its branches to the rope over his shoulder. He moves with deliberate care, shifting the rope's tension by what must be no more than a hair's breadth. Too fast, he says, and the tree remembers to resist. You think of the straight, stubborn tree in the citrus grove earlier, and wonder if it had simply remembered too well. Above you, the stars seem closer now, framed in loose spirals of leaves. A night breeze moves through them like a slow hand combing hair, and the sound follows you as you walk on. The grove opens into a circular clearing where the spirals lean outward instead of inward, their curves forming a loose ring around an open patch of grass. In the center sits a low stone platform, and on it, a single large bowl made of hammered copper. It's filled to the brim with water, so still it looks like a piece of polished metal, until a breeze scatters a handful of stars across its surface. Two gardeners sit cross-legged nearby, one older, one younger. The older man is speaking softly, tracing lines in the air with his finger, while the younger watches with the solemn attention of someone listening to a bedtime story. You step closer, and the older man gestures to the bowl. This, he says, is the sky's spiral. The major fact he's circling around is this: many Mughal gardens were designed according to celestial principles, aligning certain paths, water channels, and plantings with astronomical events. The spiral trees in this clearing, he explains, are arranged to mimic the paths of certain stars over the course of a year. Whether the resemblance is exact or just artistically inspired is hard to say. Historians still debate the precision of such alignments, given the observational tools of the time. The curious tidbit here is oddly domestic. The copper bowl is refilled every evening, not by the gardeners, but by the kitchen staff from the palace nearby. It's said that if the kitchen's food that night is too spicy, the water will taste faintly of cardamom, as the ladle used for curries is the same one used for filling the bowl. The gardeners don't mind. They say the trees like variety. The younger gardener dips a hand into the bowl, sending ripples across the reflected stars. The spiral trees around the clearing sway slightly in the breeze, their curves catching slivers of moonlight. The older man watches you for a moment, then says, "A spiral is just a straight line that remembers it could be more interesting." You sit on the edge of the stone platform, letting the copper bowl's cool surface press against your palm. Somewhere far off, a night bird calls, its sound spiraling upward into the dark. The trees seem to lean closer, as if listening. When you stand, the gardeners return to their quiet conversation. You take a last look at the bowl, its surface smoothing back to stillness, and step once more into the winding path beyond. The spirals here seem to close in around you, guiding you onward like a slow, silent current. The path feels narrower now, the soil springy underfoot, littered with the soft debris of fallen petals. You notice the scent, first heavy, heady, somewhere between roses and something darker, almost like resin. The spirals here belong to flowering trees, their branches thick with blooms that spill in great swirls of pink and white. In the moonlight, the petals look almost weightless, like slow snowfall in warm air. You brush past one low branch, and a few blossoms fall into your hair. Somewhere above, you hear a faint snipping sound. Tilting your head back, you spot a gardener balanced in the crook of a spiraled trunk, trimming flowers with tiny shears. His movements are unhurried, almost sleepy, as if he's pruning in time with his own breathing. Your major fact here is that ornamental flowering trees in Mughal gardens, particularly varieties like champa and gulmohar, were often trained alongside fruiting spirals. This pairing wasn't only for beauty. The blossom's scent was believed to deter certain pests from the more vulnerable fruit trees nearby. The spirals made pruning easier too, bringing high blossoms down within reach without ladders. The odd little tidbit reveals itself when you notice something glinting in the petals, scattered at your feet, tiny flakes of gold leaf. You pick one up, paper thin and almost too light to feel. The gardener calls down that gold leaf is sometimes brushed onto the blossoms before royal visits. So when petals fall into the water channels, the streams appear flecked with sunlight. Historians still debate whether this was a genuine horticultural practice or simply a courtly exaggeration that stuck in travelers' journals. The gardener drops a single trimmed branch toward you, its spiral of blossoms intact. You catch it, feeling the cool weight of dew on the petals. For a moment, the scent is so strong it's almost dizzying. You keep walking, the branch in hand, until the sound of shears fades into the rustle of leaves. The path here bends more sharply, curling back on itself before releasing you into a space where the air feels different, again drier. As though the garden is slowly changing seasons around you, you step into a grove where the spirals are leaner, tighter, their trunks thinner but taller, climbing upward like corkscrews reaching for the stars. The canopy is higher here, the moonlight broken into thin ribbons that stripe the ground. Beneath the trees, there's very little undergrowth, just bare earth, swept clean. Leaning against one of the trunks is a tall ladder made of bamboo, though it doesn't seem needed. The spirals bring many branches within arm's reach. A young man sits cross-legged nearby, sharpening a small sickle on a whetstone. The scrape of metal on stone repeats, steady as a heartbeat. The major fact for this place: spiral training wasn't always purely decorative. In some cases, it was used to create living trellises for climbing crops, gourds, beans, even medicinal vines, allowing for efficient harvesting without damaging the main tree. These tight spiral groves were the empire's quiet kitchen gardens, tucked away from the grandeur of the public courtyards. The unusual tidbit comes into focus when you notice small bundles hanging from several branches, cloth pouches, each tied with a neat knot. The young man explains they're filled with a mixture of spices: cumin, fenugreek, black pepper. The scent keeps certain pests away. But there's also a local belief that the trees learn the flavors, passing a hint of them into the fruits they bear. Historians still shake their heads over whether this counts as clever cultivation or just culinary optimism. The young man finishes sharpening his sickle, wipes it on the hem of his tunic, and gestures toward a nearby spiral where long pale gourds hang in a neat corkscrew pattern. He offers you one, freshly cut, still cool to the touch. "It will taste better tomorrow," he says. Everything does when it waits. You walk on, carrying the gourd, its weight balanced in your palm. The grove thins, and you can see lantern light ahead, flickering through the leaves in irregular patterns. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, and somewhere far off, A flute is playing a low, slow melody that seems to coil in the air just like the branches above you. The lantern light draws you into a small courtyard enclosed on 3 sides by low sandstone walls. The 4th side is open to the night, framing a view of the spiraled grove beyond. In the center of the courtyard stands a wide, shallow brazier where a small fire burns, its flames no taller than your hand. Around it, 3 gardeners sit in easy silence, their faces lit in warm gold against the cool silver of the moonlight. You join them without invitation, and no one seems to mind. One at a gardener's, a woman with a long braid wound twice around her head, stirs the coals with a thin iron rod. The air smells faintly of sandalwood. On the ground beside her, there's a stack of narrow wooden boards, each carved with a spiral pattern. She picks one up, dips it briefly into a bowl of water, then lays it over the coals. The steam rises in gentle curls. The major fact here is subtle. In some Mughal gardens, spiral patterns weren't confined to trees. They appeared in everything: carvings, walkways, irrigation layouts, even the grain of wood used in decorative elements. Gardeners sometimes used heated, moistened wood boards like these to create trellises or plant supports that echoed the same graceful curves found in the groves. The curious tidbit comes when the braid-crowned woman gestures toward a small pot near the brazier. Inside is a thick paste, the color of dark honey. She explains it's made of crushed tamarind seeds and jaggery, used to sweeten the ropes that guide young branches. Supposedly, the scent attracts certain harmless insects whose movement along the rope teaches the tree which way to turn. Historians, with varying degrees of skepticism, note this might be the most patient pest training in recorded history. A breeze passes through the courtyard, carrying the faint murmur of the flute you heard earlier. The sound doesn't quite have a melody, it winds and loops, almost as if it's echoing the very shapes of the trees. One of the other gardeners leans back against the wall, eyes half closed, and says quietly, "It's easier to dream in spirals." You stay for a while, watching the steam rise from the boards, until the fire burns low. Then you stand, stepping back into the night, the scent of sandalwood and tamarind clinging to your clothes. The path beyond leads you into deeper shadow, where the spirals are so tight and close together that moonlight struggles to slip between them. Here, the garden feels almost like a corridor. The trunks twist upward on either side, leaning just enough to create the impression of being inside a vast, leafy tunnel. The air is cooler, and you can hear the faint drip of water somewhere far ahead. Your footsteps are hushed by a carpet of fallen leaves, their edges curling in miniature spirals of their own. A figure emerges from the shadows, a thin man with an armful of bamboo poles. He balances them effortlessly, stepping lightly along the path, as though he's done this every night for decades. When he sees you, he pauses and rests the poles against one shoulder. "You're walking the night coil," he says. "It's where we train the trees to listen." Your major fact for this section: certain parts of Mughal gardens were intentionally designed for nighttime care. Cooler temperatures reduced stress on young branches during shaping, and the stillness of evening allowed gardeners to make precise adjustments without wind interference. The night coil paths like this one were particularly suited for training tight spirals, as the absence of harsh sunlight minimized leaf damage during manipulation. The odd tidbit comes when you notice the man tying a small bell no bigger than a walnut to the tip of a bamboo pole. He explains that these bells are hung from selected branches overnight. The soft chime in the breeze is said to remind the trees to move with the wind rather than resist it. Whether that's careful botanical wisdom or the 17th century equivalent of a motivational podcast is up for debate. Historians still can't decide if it had any measurable effect, though they agree the sound must have been beautiful. As you walk with him, the bamboo poles click softly against each other, blending with the occasional bell from the trees ahead. The air here feels more alive somehow, as though the spirals are indeed listening. Every few steps, the man stops to adjust a rope, secure a pole, or tilt a branch ever so slightly, movements so small they might be invisible to anyone less patient. Eventually, the sound of dripping water grows louder, and you come to a small stone basin set at the end of the path. The water spills from a carved spout shaped like a nautilus shell, its spiral ridges catching the moonlight. The man fills a clay cup from the basin and offers it to you. The water is cool, faintly sweet, and tastes of stone and night air. You hand the cup back, and he nods toward another archway ahead. "That path will take you to the oldest spiral," he says. His tone suggests it's worth the walk. The archway is lower than the others you've passed tonight. Its top woven from two massive branches fused together over decades of careful shaping. You duck beneath it and find yourself on a path so soft it feels almost like moss. Though in the dim light you can see it's a thick carpet of fine silvery grass. The air here is cooler still, tinged with the faint scent of sandalwood smoke, as though someone lit incense long ago and left it to fade. The path curves gently, and then you see it, the oldest spiral in the garden. Its trunk is thick as a city well, the bark deep with ridges, each one mapping centuries of growth. The spiral is broad, generous, each turn rising slowly before shifting inward, like the measured breath of something ancient and calm. The branches stretch so wide, they nearly graze the ground before curling back up toward the night sky. Your major fact here: records suggest that certain Mughal gardens kept living specimens for centuries, passing their care from one generation of gardeners to the next. These older spirals often became symbols in themselves, representations of dynastic continuity, patience, and the empire's relationship with time. Visitors from other courts sometimes left offerings at the base of such trees, as one might for a shrine. You notice a small pile of objects at its roots: bits of polished quartz, a few copper coins, dried petals bound in silk thread, and then, oddly, a carved wooden toy horse no bigger than your palm. A voice at your side explains it was left by a child who came here once with her father and insisted the tree would like a friend. Historians don't debate this one, they just record it as one of the stranger examples of courtly folklore. You walk slowly around the spiral, the path dipping slightly with each turn. It takes longer than you expect. This tree has been given the space to stretch its life into wide, slow curves. When you come full circle, the air feels different, as if you've walked through a quiet ritual without meaning to. Leaning against the trunk, you can feel a faint vibration, not wind, not footsteps. Perhaps just the sound of sap moving, the long, slow heartbeat of something that will keep growing long after you've gone. Leaving the oldest spiral feels a little like stepping back into ordinary time. The path beyond is narrower, bordered by younger trees whose spirals are still loose and uncertain, like handwriting not yet practiced. Their branches are tied with strips of cloth in deep saffron, the color bright even in the moonlight. Ahead, a man is seated cross-legged on the ground, working with a small pile of tools: thin blades, smooth stones, coils of rope. Beside him is a low tray of seedlings, each barely more than 2 leaves rising from the soil. He greets you with a nod but doesn't stop his work, trimming away the tiniest shoots from one seedling before tucking it back into its tray. Your major fact here: spiral training often began when the plant was barely past the seedling stage. Early shaping allowed the trunk to develop strength along its intended curve, reducing the need for heavier correction later. The process could take years before any visible spiral emerged, but the Mughal gardeners saw this as the foundation for all future beauty. The curious tidbit is in his other hand, a small pouch of ground saffron mixed with ghee. He dips his fingertip in the mixture and rubs it lightly along the seedling stems. He says it warms the heart of the plant. Whether he means this literally or figuratively is impossible to tell, and historians are equally split. Some suggest it was a mild insect repellent, others that it was a purely ceremonial gesture meant to mark the plant as part of the royal garden. He picks up a seedling, holds it at eye level, and turns it slowly, as though checking its posture. Then, with great care, he ties the soft stem to a thin reed, bending it just a fraction before setting it back down. Watching him, you realize the spiral's patience isn't just in the trees, it's in the hands that shape them. The endless repetition of small, deliberate motions. When you continue down the path, the younger trees give way to a more open stretch, where you can see the lantern glow of the pavilions in the distance again. The night feels lighter here, the air carrying a faint trace of jasmine. The spirals are behind you for now, but the shapes linger in your mind, curling and uncurling like thoughts you'll keep returning to. The open stretch of path feels almost like a release after so many hours in the close embrace of the spirals. The night air moves more freely here, carrying with it the mingled sense of water, stone, and distant cooking fires. The stars above seem wider apart, and for the first time in a while, you notice the horizon, a faint silver rim against the darkness where the first hints of dawn will eventually appear. Ahead, the path slopes gently upward to a small stone terrace. From here, the garden unfolds in layers beneath you. the tighter, more secretive spirals near the center, the experimental groves curling beside the water, the wide, generous turns of the oldest tree, and finally, the younger coils at the far edge, still tentative in their shape. Lanterns wink here and there among the branches, and the faint sound of water trickles through the silence, winding as patiently as the paths themselves. Your final major fact: the spiral gardens were not just feats of design or patience, they were also living archives. Each tree's curve recorded decades of human care, climatic shifts, and even political change. In times of peace, the spirals grew uninterrupted. In times of conflict, their growth stalled, branches left untended. By walking the spirals, a trained eye could read a century's worth of history without a single page of parchment. A small, curious detail catches your attention on the terrace wall. Tiny handprints pressed into the stone while it was still wet, centuries ago. They're too small to be adult hands, perhaps belonging to the children of gardeners, or simply too curious onlookers allowed inside the worksites. Historians haven't agreed whether this was a formal tradition or just mischief that became immortal by accident. You rest your hands on the cool stone railing, looking out over the garden's soft geometry. Somewhere below, a flute plays against lower now, as though its notes are being laid down carefully, one curve at a time. Night is nearly spent, and yet the spirals feel endless, each one continuing beyond your sight, beyond even this moment in time. The ocean is barely awake. A thin layer of morning mist stretches lazily over the waves, as though it has no particular deadline. The air tastes faintly of salt, though not in that dramatic sea spray way from movies, more like the mild temps left behind after boiling pasta water. You're standing on the deck of a walker, a long, sleek canoe built from wood that still carries the smell of the forest it came from. You feel the gentle rock of the hull beneath your feet, a slow rhythm that's almost a lullaby. Somewhere behind you, a single gull cries out, but even it sounds sleepy. The horizon is wide and pale, like someone accidentally left the brightness setting too low. And just so you know, you probably won't make it through this day. Not because of danger though, storms are possible, but because, if I'm doing this right, you'll be sound asleep before the sun even reaches its peak. So go ahead, like this video before you drift off. Subscribe so you can join us on more historical naps. And, if you're still conscious, leave a comment with your location and the local time. I like knowing where these quiet journeys find people. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You are traveling with Cube, or at least a version of him passed down in oral tradition, part navigator, part storyteller, part guy who just knows things. It's the late 10th century, give or take a few decades. Historians still debate whether his voyages happened exactly as told, or if they're more of a poetic composite. Either way, you're here now, and the water under your canoe says it's real enough. The walker is moving under the power of a steady paddle rhythm. The paddlers' strokes are so uniform they could almost be synchronized swimmers, except their swimming pool is roughly the size of the Pacific Ocean. Cube stands near the front, looking not at the water, but at the sky. The major fact you'll want to hold onto at least until you drift off is that Maori navigators could read clouds as if they were maps. Certain shapes meant certain islands, because clouds gather differently over land than they do over the open ocean. It's a little like checking Google Maps. If Google Maps were made entirely of floating vapor and light, and occasionally dissolved into nothing, you notice Cube squinting. He's studying a flat-topped, dark underbellied cloud far on the horizon. It's the kind of cloud you might think was just having a bad day, but to him it's the sign of an island's forest, trapping moisture and pushing it upward. To you, it looks like a cloud. To him, it's a welcome sign. Someone nearby hands you a gourd of water. It's surprisingly warm. The crew laughs quietly at your face, and one man says something that, judging by his tone, is probably along the lines of "Don't worry, it's fresh." They store it in woven flax containers that warm in the sun, practical, though perhaps not what you'd call refreshing. Off to the left, you see a small woven charm hanging from the mast. It's shaped like a bird with exaggerated wings, meant to call on the spirit of the Manu birds, who guided navigators by flying in predictable arcs between their nests and food sources. You remember this charm because you saw one earlier in a village, but now it swings gently with the boat's motion, like it has all the time in the world. You breathe slowly. The sky is lightening, though the sun has yet to fully crest. Somewhere in this expanse, There's an island waiting though. Whether you'll actually get there before your eyelids get heavy is another matter entirely. The morning grows brighter, but in that unhurried way that suggests the sun has been procrastinating. The paddles dip and rise, each movement making the waka creak like an old wooden door that's somehow perfectly fine with its life choices. You lean back against the side, feeling the heat of the sun starting to soak into the planks. Coop's eyes are still on the clouds. The flat-topped one is larger now, its dark base stretching wider as the distance closes. He doesn't rush, he doesn't need to. Out here, rushing is like yelling at bread to toast faster. Just makes you look impatient in front of people who have nowhere else to be. The air smells faintly of dried fish. Breakfast is being passed around. Small parcels of preserved kahawe, the salty, slightly chewy fish that keeps for weeks. You're not entirely sure if it's delicious or just food-shaped, but your stomach seems to vote in its favor. Someone points to a cluster of small, puffy clouds above the horizon on the other side. They call them pua, kauai, likening their shape to kauai blossoms. The blossoms themselves are bright yellow, but these clouds are the soft white of steamed bread. The strange tidbit here is that the name is both poetic and practical. Those clouds often form over warm currents where fish gather. It's like nature's version of a roadside diner sign, but for sailors. As you chew, you notice the canoe's sail, furled now, stitched from rubber reeds. You run your fingers over the pattern-tight weaving, surprisingly smooth to the touch. Someone tells you this sail will go up when the wind shifts, and that it's best not to lean against it when it's catching wind unless you want to take an unplanned swim. You nod, trying to imagine a planned swim out here. Historians still debate whether Coop's voyage was a deliberate search for new lands or a chase after a runaway fishing competitor named Mutarangi. The oral tradition is rich with adventure. There's even mention of a giant octopus butt. The scholarly consensus is that probably some bits are more metaphor than fact. You decide you're fine with both possibilities. The ocean surface starts to shimmer. Tiny flying fish break the surface, flitting like skipping stones before vanishing again. One nearly lands in the canoe, but thinks better of it. A boy at the bow laughs and mimics its awkward airborne wiggle. You glance at the horizon again. That cloud formation, the one Coop's been tracking, has changed. Beneath it, you can now make out the faint green smudge of land. It feels far, but somehow inevitable. The way a long yawn is inevitable once it starts. The wacker's pace changes. It's not faster, exactly, just more deliberate. You hear quiet conversation about reefs, currents, and the approach angle. Coop gestures toward the sky again, pointing out how the clouds directly above the green blur are thinner now, as though the island itself is drawing them apart. You try to see what he sees. Maybe you do, maybe you're just humoring him. The sun is climbing higher, but its heat is still soft, wrapping you like a blanket that hasn't quite made up its mind. Your eyelids feel heavier than they should for mid-morning. The rhythmic paddling doesn't help, nor does the steady slap of water against the hull, or the gulls overhead, their calls coming slower now, as if they, too, have been lulled into drowsy patience. Somewhere, a light breeze picks up, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, the kind you only smell when you're close to shore. It makes your stomach twist in mild anticipation, the way arriving somewhere always does, even if you don't know what's waiting. You rest your head against the gunwale. The sound of paddles, the creak of the hull, the faint chuckle of Coop talking with the crew, it all melts into one soft, continuous hum. Land is ahead. Sleep might be closer. The shoreline is still a watercolor smudge when you first notice the birds. Not the occasional lone gull anymore, but whole flocksterns, sheer waters gliding above the water in confident arcs. You get the sense they've made this commute so many times they could do it in their sleep. In that way, they're sort of like you. Coop gestures to them, explaining without words that their flight patterns mean the island is close. It's a major fact worth noting. Maori navigators tracked the daily habits of seabirds, knowing which species could travel far from land and which would only venture a short distance before returning to their nests. It's like watching commuters. Some live way out in the suburbs, some are just going to the corner store. The paddles keep their pace. It's not frantic, but there's a subtle energy in the crew now. A quiet anticipation. The water has shifted, color still blue, but warmer, touched with hints of green where sunlight hits. It's the kind of green you might call tropical, if you were designing a paint swatch. Though out here it's simply the ocean being itself. An odd little fact slips into your awareness. One crew member wears a pendant carved into the shape of a lizard. He tells you, through a mix of words and gestures, that lizards are messengers in some traditions, symbols of alertness. You're not entirely sure how alert you're feeling right now, considering your eyelids are staging a quiet rebellion. The walker glides through a patch of calmer water, and you realize you can see the sandy bottom now, faint but therein underwater ghost of the island ahead. The waves are smaller, as if they, too, have decided to slow down for the approach. Historians still debate whether the first arrivals to these shores found them already inhabited by other Polynesian settlers, or if Coop's party was among the very first humans here. You look at the distant trees, dark, towering shapes, and wonder how it must have felt to see them for the first time, without knowing what or who might be living among them. The island is clearer now. You can make out the gentle slope of the beach, the dense forest behind it. From here, the trees look like one continuous wall, their tops forming a jagged, irregular skyline. Somewhere behind that green curtain, birds you've never heard before are calling to each other in sharp, bright tones. The paddles slow. The air smells different, now warm earth, tangy seaweed drying on rocks, something faintly floral. You breathe in deeply, feeling the shift in atmosphere. The crew exchanges glances that carry the weight of arrival without the need for words. The waka drifts closer. The water here is so clear you can see schools of small fish darting between rocks. They flash silver in the sunlight, vanishing and reappearing like coins flipping in slow motion. A final long stroke of the paddles, and the hull scrapes softly against sand. The sound is almost apologetic, as if the boat is saying, "Well, I guess we're here now." The crew begins unloading bundles wrapped in woven mat stools, food, water containers, small charms. You step onto the beach, your feet sinking slightly into the warm, damp sand. Behind you, the ocean is a restless expanse. Ahead, the forest waits, silent but watchful. You get the feeling this place has been here for a very long time, and it's in no hurry to reveal itself to newcomers. Somewhere in the trees, a branch creaks, or maybe something moves. You're not sure. You just know the journey has shifted now from navigating waves and clouds to navigating something much denser, much greener. The first steps into the forest feel like walking through a curtain. The air changes heavier, cooler, carrying the damp scent of soil and leaves. The sunlight that was so bright on the beach now filters in as narrow, shifting beams, as if the forest is rationing it. The crew moves in single file along a path that's more suggestion than trail. Roots curl across the ground like lazy snakes, and ferns taller than your head sway faintly in the breeze. Somewhere overhead, you hear the slow, deliberate wing beats of a large bird. Its shadow passes over you, gone before you can look up. Coop pauses at a small clearing. He squats, presses his palm to the soil, then nods, as though confirming something only he can read. He says a few words to the others, and the crew sets down their loads. This, apparently, is where they'll make camp. The major fact for this stretch of the story: Maori voyaging parties often established temporary camps near the shore before exploring further inland, giving them a base to store supplies and prepare canoes for the return journey. In other words, they were practical enough to not wander off into unknown forests without a safe spot to come back to, something modern hikers might also consider. One crew member begins weaving a quick windbreak from cut ferns and supple branches. The speed is impressive. The structure rises in minutes, green and fragrant. Another starts arranging stones for a small fire pit. The stones are damp and mossy, and you learn a useful tidbit: always dry them before placing them near flame, unless you want them to explode dramatically. Historians still debate whether Coop stayed long in these first landing spots, or moved quickly inland to scout resources. Oral accounts differ, and the forest isn't in a hurry to give up its own version of events. The ground underfoot is soft with leaf litter. You walk a short distance and spot a stream, a narrow ribbon of clear water winding between mossy rocks. The surface shimmers with reflected light, and small insects hover above it, tracing lazy circles in the air. You kneel and dip your fingers in. The water is cold enough to make you gasp softly. You return to camp as the smell of cooking fish begins to drift through the clearing. The crew has found a few fat kahawai in the shallows, and now they're roasting them slowly over a small fire. The crackle of flames is comforting, almost hypnotic. Someone hands you a piece of fish wrapped in a fresh leaf. It's moist, smoky, and at least, in this moment, perfect. As the light fades, Coop sits near the fire, tracing shapes in the air with his finger as he speaks. You can't understand all the words, but you recognize some. Names of stars, winds, and distant islands. The flames throw shifting shadows across his face, making it hard to tell whether he's telling a story or reciting a memory. Beyond the firelight, the forest hums with nightlife chirps, clicks, faint rustlings in the undergrowth. Somewhere far off, the sound of the ocean drifts through the trees, a distant reminder of the journey you've already made. You lie back on a woven mat, the earth beneath you cool and solid. Above, the canopy lets through only small scraps of night sky, where the stars blink like patient watchmen. Your eyelids sink, the fire pops softly. The world smells of smoke, salt, and leaves. The day has been long, but here, in the forest, it feels like it's just beginning. Morning in the forest doesn't exactly burst in its seeps. A soft pale light filters down through the canopy in thin strands, like the forest is testing the day before committing to it. The air is still cool, damp enough that each breath tastes faintly of moss. Somewhere above, a tui sings a complicated, almost suafi song, pausing occasionally as if to see if anyone is impressed. You rise to find the crew already moving. Coop is crouched near the stream, rinsing his face, the water glinting as it flows past his hands. Others are checking nets they set in the shallows last night. 2 small eels wriggle in one slippery, twisting ribbons of mussel. The man holding the net grins like he's just found loose change in an old coat. Today's major fact: early Maori navigators didn't just rely on the ocean, they were skilled in reading inland water systems too, often using streams and rivers as guides for settlement spots, fishing, and fresh water sources. A well-placed camp near both forest and stream meant food, shelter, and security all at once. One man breaks open a bundle of taro roots, freshly dug from a damp patch not far from the camp. Their brown, hairy skins don't look promising, but you've learned not to judge early morning food by appearance. Soon they're roasting beside the fire, sending up a warm, nutty smell. An odd cultural tidbit emerges during breakfast. A crew member offers you a slice of roasted taro, but insists you take it with your left hand. He smiles as he explains through a mix of words and pantomime that the left hand, in this moment, is the guest's hand. Whether this is tradition, superstition, or just a running joke at your expense, you can't quite tell. Historians still debate exactly which plants Coop's crew would have brought from their homeland, and which they would have foraged here. Some say they carried kumara sweet potato, seedlings wrapped carefully for the voyage. Others think those came later with different migrations. Either way, the breakfast is earthy, filling, and exactly the kind of meal you could nap after. After eating, Coop leads a small group, you included, up a gentle slope away from camp. The forest floor is springy with layers of fallen leaves, and the air is full of the dry rattle of cicadas. Sunlight flickers in and out as the trees thin slightly. From the crest of the slope, you can see the ocean again, bright and open, the waka resting like a sleeping seal on the sand. The walk back to camp feels slower, not because you're tired, but because there's a growing sense that this place is settling into you. The smell of the fire reaches you before the camp itself comes into view, mingling with the sharper scent of the eels roasting now. By midday, the crew is lounging in the filtered light, weaving nets, mending a paddle, or simply lying back with eyes closed. Time here is measured more by the angle of the sun than any kind of urgency. The day drifts, and so do you, somewhere between wakefulness and the slow, even breathing of sleep. Dawn arrives in muted colors, as though the sky has decided to take a softer approach today. The air feels thicker than yesterday, heavier with moisture, and the sound of the surf is muffled, wrapped in a blanket of mist. You wake to see the camp in a haze, shapes of people moving like slow shadows, their outlines blurred by the damp air. Coop is already standing near the fire, his hair beaded with droplets. He holds a small carved stick in one hand, etching patterns in the dirt as he talks quietly with another crew member. The patterns look random to you, but you have the sense they're anything but. Today's major fact: Maori navigators sometimes used patterns drawn in sand or earth as memory aids for star positions, seasonal winds, and island chains. The designs weren't maps in the modern sense, but visual prompts, reminders to spark the memory of the person who already knew the route by heart. The smell of smoky fish still lingers in the air from last night. You sit down near the fire, cupping your hands around a small wooden bowl of warm liquid. It's a mild broth, salty and faintly sweet, made from boiling seaweed with a few scraps of fish. It's not the kind of thing you'd order at a cafe, but here, in the mist, it feels like exactly the right thing to be holding. An odd tidbit emerges as you eat. A young crew member tells you, with a straight face, that mist is a sign the forest is exhaling. Whether this is a poetic explanation, a bit of superstition, or just something they say to newcomers, you can't tell. But you notice yourself breathing slower anyway, as if to match the rhythm. Historians still debate whether Cup's landfall locations were chosen for specific resources, or if they were simply the first safe harbors found after a long crossing. The oral accounts lean toward intention, but the historians shrugged is a recurring theme. As the mist thins, Cup signals for a group to prepare. Today's plan is to follow the stream inland, mapping where it leads, and seeing if it connects to any larger body of water. The path is narrow, lined with ferns and moss-covered stones. The ground squelches softly under your feet, but not unpleasantly. Birdsong follows you into the deeper forest, layered and constant. Some calls are sharp and metallic, others soft and almost conversational. Every so often, the stream's course dips into a small pool, its surface broken by the dart of a fish or the fall of a leaf. By midday, the mist has lifted entirely. Sunlight warms your back, and the forest hums with insect life. The stream bends, then widens into a larger river, the water moving swiftly over dark rocks. Cup squats by the bank, watching the flow, as if reading something in the ripples that you can't see. When you return to camp in the late afternoon, the air feels lighter. The walker rests exactly where you left it, and the fire has been kept alive by the few who stayed behind. The smell of roasting taro greets you, and the day drifts into that slow, timeless rhythm you're starting to recognize, the one where nothing is urgent, and the night always comes gently. The night is warm, and the forest doesn't seem to sleep at all. You wake once to the call of a bird you've never heard before, deep, resonant, almost like the sound of a drum echoing far away. Then you drift off again, the sound folding into your dreams. Morning brings clear skies for the first time in days. The ocean is visible from camp now, its surface glittering in the sun. Cup stands at the edge of the clearing, watching the tree line, as though waiting for something to emerge. Today's major fact: cloud watching wasn't only for open ocean navigation. Even from shore, experienced navigators could read the way clouds formed over distant headlands or inland ranges, using them as silent weather forecasts. Here, a sudden tall cumulus over the western hills might mean a front moving in. Thin high clouds could signal calm weather ahead. Breakfast is simple leftover roasted taro, wrapped in leaves and warmed over the embers. A crew member hums as he works, a repetitive tune that seems designed less for performance and more for keeping pace with the task. You find yourself matching your breathing to it without realizing. An odd cultural tidbit slips in when another crewmate starts tying a thin strip of flax around his wrist. Before heading toward the waka, he explains that it's for remembering the wind, a personal ritual before sailing, the meaning of which he doesn't elaborate on. You consider asking, but the look in his eyes suggests the explanation might be less satisfying than the mystery. Historians still debate how much of Cup's journey was driven by seasonal timing weather. They left home in alignment with known weather patterns or took a more opportunistic approach, moving when conditions simply allowed. By mid-morning, you're in the Walker again, this time following the coastline to the north. The cliffs here rise steeply from the sea, their faces streaked with lines of pale stone. Small waterfalls spill directly into the ocean, vanishing into white spray. At one point, Cup points upward, toward a flat ledge where a cluster of seabirds is nesting. Their cries echo off the cliff in a way that makes it hard to tell how many there are. The sound is sharp, but oddly rhythmic, as though the birds are scolding the waves for getting too close. The Waka passes into a small sheltered cove, where the water shifts to a deep green. Seaweed sways beneath the surface, long fronds moving like the hair of someone dozing underwater. You rest your paddle on the gunwale and watch the patterns it makes, hypnotic in their slow repetition. By the time you return to camp, the sun is low. Shadows gather quickly in the forest, pooling in the spaces between trees. The fire is already lit, its light flickering across the faces of the crew. The night air smells of wood smoke and salt. You lie down, the woven mat rough beneath your fingers, and listen to the soft chorus of ocean and forest blending together. The stars above seem closer tonight, crowding in as if to hear the same story you've been living all along. The morning starts with a hush so complete that even the forest seems to be holding its breath. No gulls, no crashing surf, just the low hum of insects and the faint lap of water somewhere beyond the trees. You rise to find Coop crouched by the fire pit, turning over a half-burnt log and coaxing the embers back to life. The smoke curls upward lazily, then disappears into the canopy. Today's major fact: fire on voyages wasn't simply for cooking or warmth, it was often kept alive deliberately, transported in embers wrapped in damp materials like bark or moss, so it could be rekindled quickly without striking new sparks. Losing the fire entirely meant a tedious and sometimes dangerous process to make it again. You take a seat near the warmth, hands around a small gourd of water. The morning air tastes faintly metallic, like rain might be coming. A crewmate offers you a piece of dried fish, and you accept, even though it's still early enough that breakfast feels like an abstract concept. An odd tidbit surfaces as someone begins braiding a long cord from flax fibers. They explain that the cord is for measuring not in units like feet or meters, but in body lengths. The span from fingertip to fingertip, the length from hip to ground, the distance of an outstretched arm, all of these could become standard measures when repeated often enough. It makes sense. In a way, you can't misplace your arms at sea. Historians still debate how strictly navigators adhered to such measurements versus relying on memory and environmental cues. The accounts blur, mixing technical skill with instinct in a way that resists clean categorization. By mid-morning, Coop calls for another scouting trip. This time the waka is loaded with nets and a few spears. The plan, as far as you can tell, is part fishing, part mapping the river mouth a short distance up the coast. The paddle out is smooth. The ocean has that glassy look it gets on calm days, reflecting the sky so perfectly that the horizon is more of a suggestion than a line. You follow the curve of the shoreline until the river mouth appears a wide, dark opening where fresh water spills into the sea. The current here is strong, swirling in patterns that tug at the waka as it edges in. Fish flash just below the surface, their scales catching the light. Nets are cast, weighted with smooth stones, and soon they come up writhing with silver. The work is quick and quiet, each person moving with practiced efficiency. By the time you return to camp, the sun is high, and the forest hums with midday heat. The fish are cleaned and set to smoke over the fire, their scent drifting through the clearing. The afternoon slides past without urgency, the air thick with the promise of a slow evening. The day begins with the call of a bird that sounds suspiciously like someone clearing their throat. You open your eyes to find sunlight already filtering through the canopy in bright patches, the kind that seem to move even when you're sure you're sitting still. Coop is in the clearing, examining a long piece of driftwood that must have washed up overnight. He runs his hand over its surface, checking for cracks or softness. The major fact here: good timber was valuable, even for those who already had a seaworthy canoe. Driftwood from distant islands could be repurposed into paddles, repair pieces, or even ceremonial objects, its origin giving it a kind of prestige. Breakfast is a mix of smoked fish and roasted fern root. The latter has a dense, earthy flavor, like eating the forest floor, in the most polite way possible. As you chew, one crewmate tells you about a game they sometimes play while traveling, trying to guess an island's resources just by its smell before making landfall. It's a strange tidbit, but they swear that the combination of vegetation, soil, and sea can reveal a surprising amount before you even see the shore. Historians still debate whether such skills were deliberately taught or picked up over time through constant exposure. Oral tradition often makes no distinction. Learning was simply part of living. By mid-morning, Coop decides to explore inland again, this time following a ridge that rises steeply behind the camp. The climb is slow, the ground uneven and tangled with roots. Every so often, the canopy parts, giving you a glimpse of the ocean far below, glittering in the sunlight. At the top, the ridge flattens into a narrow plateau. Here, the wind is stronger, carrying the scent of salt and something sharper, perhaps flowering shrubs you can't see. From this vantage point, the coastline stretches out in both directions, bays and headlands alternating like a patterned cloak. Coop points to a distant curve of land, where the waves break in a wide arc of white foam. He speaks quietly, naming it in a way that makes you think he's filing it away for later, a new marker in the mental map he carries. The walk back down is quieter, the crew lost in their own thoughts. By the time you reach camp, the sun is low, and the fire is already going. The smell of roasting fish fills the air again, mingling with the resinous scent of fresh-cut wood. That night, lying on your mat, you listen to the rhythmic hiss of the ocean beyond the trees. The stars are bright again, scattered thick across the sky. You find yourself wondering how many of them have guided this crew before, and how many will guide them home. The morning feels lighter, as if the air itself has been rinsed clean. The forest smells sharper wet leaves, resin, and the faint sweetness of blooming plants somewhere unseen. A thin mist lingers near the ground, curling around the ankles of anyone moving through the clearing. Coop is already by the waka on the beach, inspecting its hull. He runs his hands along the planks, pressing occasionally at the joints where the lashings hold them together. Today's major fact: traditional waka were built without nails, relying instead on intricate lashings made from plant fibers. These bindings, when kept taut and well oiled, could endure years of voyages across open seas. You join him on the sand, where a few others are laying out strips of flax to dry in the sun. The fibers glisten slightly with residual sap. A crew member explains that they'll be twisted into cord for repairs, the work best done when the strands are warm and pliable. A curious tidbit comes up when someone points to a small shell embedded in the hull near the bow. It wasn't an accident, they placed it there deliberately. It's said to be a listening shell, a charm meant to help the canoe hear the sea and respond to it. Whether that's symbolic or literal depends on who you ask. Historians still debate how much of these charms and embellishments were purely functional versus spiritual. The line between the two wasn't always drawn the way modern thinking might expect. By mid-morning, Coop calls for a short coastal journey. The walker slides easily into the water, the paddles dipping in with that familiar, steady rhythm. You follow the curve of the bay until a rocky point juts into the sea. The waves slap against its sides, sending up spray that catches the sun in brief flashes. Beyond the point, the coast straightens, and you spot another small beach, empty except for a line of driftwood pushed high by past storms. You land there, pulling the waka above the tide line. The afternoon is spent gathering shellfish from the shallow spua, their iridescent shells glimmering even underwater, and tuatua, buried just beneath the sand. The work is slow but oddly satisfying. Each find a small treasure. By the time you return to camp, the catch is heavy, and the sun is beginning its slow slide toward the horizon. That night, the fire burns brighter, reflecting off the polished pure shells scattered around it. The air hums with quiet talk, the kind that blends easily into the surrounding sounds of the night. You fall asleep to the steady rhythm of waves on the shore, each one sounding like the breath of something vast and patient. You wake to the smell of something rich and savory, a stew bubbling over the fire, thick with fish, shellfish, and fern shoots. The steam drifts upward into the cool morning air, carrying the promise of a meal worth lingering over. Coop sits nearby, sharpening the edge of a paddle with a small stone. The sound is soft but precise, each stroke measured. Today's major fact: paddles were as vital as sails, often carved to match the user's strength and reach. A well-made paddle wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of the navigator's body, and losing one could slow or halt a voyage entirely. As you eat, one of the younger crew members shows you a length of polished bone carved into a simple shape. He explains it's a hook, used for deep water fishing, but then adds that it's also considered lucky if worn around the neck on long journeys. You nod, unsure whether the luck is meant for the wearer or the fish. An odd tidbit emerges when another man describes a game played at night during calm seas, lying on your back in the canoe, staring at the stars, and trying to trace invisible paths between them that match the outlines of islands you've visited. It's half memory, half invention, and apparently more competitive than it sounds. Historians still debate whether such pastimes were purely recreational or served as informal training for recognizing star patterns. In oral traditions, teaching and leisure often walked the same path. By mid-morning, you're in the waka again, the sail raised for the first time in days. The wind is steady from the south, filling the roper reeds with a low, resonant hum. The shift in speed is immediate. You feel the canoe lift slightly, skimming over the water with less effort from the paddlers. The coastline slips past in a sequence of bays, cliffs, and small inlets, where the forest leans almost into the sea. Occasionally, Coop gestures to a feature, a headland, shaped like a sleeping bird, a reef that lies just below the surface, a stand of tall trees visible from far out. Each one is a mental note, a marker in a map that exists entirely in his mind. By late afternoon, you turn back toward camp. The return is slower, the wind easing, the paddlers falling into that unhurried rhythm again. The sun is low when you beach the canoe, its light gilding the edges of the forest. That night, as you lie down on your mat, the memory of the sail's hum stays with you, soft and constant, like the ocean whispering its own version of the story. The morning greets you with the sharp scent of the tide briny alive, edged with the faint sweetness of drying seaweed. The beach is scattered with fresh debris from the night's waves, driftwood, smooth stones, and the occasional shell glinting like a coin half buried in the sand. Coop stands at the shoreline, his gaze fixed far out to sea. The horizon is perfectly clear, the sky a pale wash that makes the line between water and air almost imaginary. Today's major fact: skilled navigators often gauged weather changes by the texture of the sea itself, how ripples formed. The color shifts beneath thin layers of cloud, even the way the wind touched the surface at different angles. You wander down to join him, the sand cool under your feet. A few crew members are already hauling the walker closer to the water, readying it for another journey. Today's goal is to scout an island faintly visible to the north, its low shape resting like a sleeping seal in the distance. Before departure, someone hands you a small pouch woven from flax. Inside are dried berries with a tart, almost citrus taste. The tidbit that comes with them is unexpected. They're said to keep your mouth from drying out at sea, but also to sweeten your words when meeting strangers. You decide it's worth keeping them close, just in case diplomacy becomes necessary. Historians still debate whether early arrivals to these islands immediately sought out neighboring landmasses or spent years settling one location before venturing further. The oral traditions suggest both paths happened, depending on the voyager's intent. The paddle north is steady, the canoe sliding through swells that rise and fall like the breathing of something enormous and slow. Birds appear first dark specks, growing into gannets and shearwaters, circling in lazy arcs over a patch of sea. Coop points, and soon you see the flicker of fish breaking the surface beneath them. By midday, the island is close enough that you can see its rocky shore and the line of dense vegetation just beyond. The beach here is narrower, hemmed in by low cliffs. Landing is careful work, the paddlers waiting for the swell to lift the walker before running it aground. The island smells different from the main camp, saltier, sharper, with a faint mineral temps from the rocks. You spend the afternoon gathering shellfish from tide pools, the water cold and clear around your hands. The pools are miniature worlds, tiny crabs darting under stones, anemones swaying gently, their colors bright even in the shade. When you depart in the late afternoon, the sun is behind you, casting the island into silhouette. The paddleback is quieter, the crew's voice is low, the rhythm unbroken. By the time you return to camp, night has already crept in, and the fire's glow is a welcome beacon among the trees. The forest wakes before you do. Birds call in overlapping layers, some bright and fluting, others low and throaty. The air is warm already, with a heaviness that suggests rain will come before the day is over. You sit up to see the camp moving at a slower pace than usual. Perhaps everyone feels the weight of the weather. Coop is speaking with two of the older crew, pointing inland toward the hills. You catch fragments about a ridge and a vantage point, and soon a small group is setting out. You included today's major fact. Elevated points inland weren't just for surveying land. They were also used to watch for weather fronts rolling in from the sea, giving navigators precious hours to prepare for sudden shifts. The climb is steady but not steep. The forest changes as you rise, the ferns giving way to shrubs and open spaces where the wind moves freely. An odd tidbit comes when a crewmate stops to show you a plant with long, narrow leaves that, when crushed, release a sweet scent. He explains it's used both to freshen sleeping mats and to repel insects, a combination that makes you wonder if modern camping gear missed a trick. Historians still debate how much inland exploration Coop himself undertook versus delegating it to others. The stories vary. Some depict him as ever curious, others as more focused on the sea. At the ridge's summit, the view is wide and unbroken. The ocean stretches out in a pale sweep, the horizon hazy with moisture. To the west, dark clouds are stacking slowly, their edges smudged and heavy. Coop watches them for a long time, then nods as if confirming something he already suspected. The return to camp is faster, the descent softened by the wind at your back. By the time you arrive, the first drops are falling, large and warm, tapping the leaves overhead like polite knuckles on a door. The crew moves quickly to cover supplies, pull the waka further up the beach, and reinforce the fern walls around the shelters. Rain comes in earnest, not long after steady, unhurried, soaking the ground and darkening the trunks of the trees. The camp smells of wet earth and wood smoke. Inside your shelter, you lie back and listen to the rain's rhythm, steady and deep, like the slow breathing of the land itself. Outside, someone hums softly, a tune without words, blending into the sound of water falling on leaves. The fire pops now and then, holding its own against the damp. You close your eyes. The rain's weight on the air, pressing you gently towards sleep. Even though the day is far from over, the rain lingers into morning, falling in a steady curtain that blurs the line between forest and ocean. The camp feels hushed, as though every movement has been slowed by the weight of water in the air. Smoke from the fire drifts low and sideways, clinging to the ground before finally rising into the damp canopy. Coop sits under a shelter of woven leaves, mending a length of rope. His fingers move with an easy confidence, each twist and pull tightening the cord. Today's major fact: lashings and rope weren't just made from flax. Other plants, like the supplejack vine, could be stripped and braided for specific strengths, depending on whether they'd be used for sail, rigging, lashings, or fishing lines. You settle beside him, watching the rain bead and run off the sloped roof of the shelter. He glances toward the ocean occasionally, though from here it's only a shifting smear of grey. A small tidbit surfaces when one of the younger crew produces a carved wooden disc no larger than your palm. It's smooth and slightly concave, and he spins it on a flat rock. The hum it produces low and steady. He grins, saying it's to call the wind, though whether that's literal, ceremonial, or just a way to pass the time on rainy days, he doesn't say. Historians still debate whether such objects had any navigational purpose or were purely symbolic, perhaps tied to ritual before voyages. The stories are fragmentary, leaving more space for wondering than for certainty. By afternoon, the rain eases. Drops still fall from the trees in uneven bursts, but the sky has brightened enough to show pale blue through the breaks. The crew moves easily through the clearing, checking the waka, rearranging bundles, and talking in low voices about the days ahead. Coop walks to the edge of the beach, you following behind. The tide is low, revealing a strip of wet sand scattered with shells and driftwood. Out beyond the breakers, the sea shifts in subtle patterns, bands of darker and lighter water, each telling a story only someone like him can fully read. He points toward the horizon, not at a cloud or bird this time, but simply into the open distance. You understand, without him saying, that this journey isn't finished, not for him, and perhaps not for you either. The ocean is always both path and question, and there is always another shore. The air is thick with a gentle kind of warmth that makes your eyelids heavier than they have any right to be. It is late afternoon in a land where the horizon stretches so wide you half expect it to crack under its own weight. A pale sun hovers low, bleeding gold into the edges of the earth. Somewhere far off, a bird makes a sound that could be a call or a complaint. It's hard to tell. And frankly, you don't feel like investigating. You are standing on a red-dusted path in the kingdom of Mutapa, deep in southern Africa, in the early 17th century. Your sandals, or whatever approximation of sandals the local craftsman could make for you, sink into the baked clay. It's the kind of heat that doesn't so much touch you as drape itself over you, heavy and clingy, like a relative who insists on hugging for just a beat too long. You shift your weight and hear the tiny whisper of sand grinding against itself. You probably won't make it through this day, not because of danger or hunger or political intrigue, but simply because it's the sort of day designed to lull you into the kind of nap from which people wake up, unsure what century they're in. Before we drift too far, if you enjoy being slowly transported to obscure corners of the past where nothing explodes and nobody's in a hurry, feel free to like this story and subscribe to the channel. If you're here already half asleep, congratulations, you're doing it right. And before your head tilts completely forward, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It's oddly comforting to know that somewhere out there, someone else is yawning too. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You follow the path toward the royal enclosure, which is less of a palace and more of an elongated cluster of low-walled courtyards. The queen you've come to see is known as Nyatsimba, though titles vary depending on which court official you ask, and how long you've let them ramble. She is said to measure time not by the sun, but by raindrops. It sounds poetic until you realize she actually means its ceremonial water jars are set beneath the eaves during storms, and the slow, steady dripping marks the passing of ritual hours. Historians still debate whether this was symbolic, practical, or just an excuse to avoid talking to visiting Portuguese envoys for several hours at a time. A young attendant in a wrap of deep ochre leads you past rows of carved wooden posts. Their designs twist and turn in ways that make you squint. You're not sure whether they're depicting history, gossip, or a kind of ancient punchline. You catch the scent of baobab fruit drying in the sunsweet, powdery and faintly citrus, like someone tried to make lemonade out of a dusty afternoon. Somewhere behind you, a goat bleats, long and indignant, as though it's just been told it cannot attend the royal audience. You keep walking, past a reed fence that hums in the breeze. It's not a normal breeze, it's the kind that carries with it a faint charge, the sort that hints at rain on the way. Nyatsimba is seated beneath a shaded canopy when you arrive. Her posture so still you wonder if she's been there for hours, or if she's just very good at pretending not to be annoyed at late arrivals. At her side, a polished copper bowl filled with rainwater glints in the fading light. Each drop that falls from the eaves above sends a soft ripple across its surface. She watches it with the attention most people reserve for court disputes or suspiciously generous trade offers. Time, she murmurs, without looking at you, is not the sun's to give. And with that, the audience begins. You're invited to, perhaps gently commanded to, sit on a woven mat across from her. The mat is warm from the day's heat, and you briefly wonder how long it takes to weave something this intricate. Probably longer than it takes to realize you're sitting directly in the sunbeam that slipped through the canopy. You shift an inch to the left, into the shade, trying to look like you meant to do that all along. Nyatsimba doesn't speak in long speeches. She speaks in pauses, each one punctuated by the tiny plink of water into the copper bowl. The major fact of the day is easy enough to see. This queen rules through both trade and diplomacy, maintaining a web of alliances that stretches across rivers, hills, and forests. Gold, ivory, and salt move through her domain like carefully guided streams. It's not an empire built on sheer force, but on currents that flow smoothly unless, of course, someone tries to stir them too quickly. An attendant appears with a small wooden platter of roasted groundnuts. They're warm, nutty, and slightly smoky, a taste that makes you think of campfires you've never actually been to. You pick one up, and it's surprisingly oily, proof that some snacks transcend centuries without changing much. There's an odd tidbit here that you might not expect. In this court, important decisions are sometimes accompanied by the soft playing of Mbiritham piano music, not to signal celebration, but to help keep the mood calm. The logic is that people are less likely to argue if their fingers are tapping along to a pleasant rhythm. Historians still debate whether this actually worked, or whether it just meant arguments happened in better harmony. Nyatsimba gestures toward the rainwater bowl. The drops are slowing. She notes this with the kind of gravity one might use to announce that the stars have shifted. The rain hasn't started yet, but the air carries that metallic scent that says it's close. You find yourself leaning in, as though you might hear the clouds assembling themselves overhead. You remember the reed fence you passed earlier, the one humming in the breeze. From here, it's visible beyond the courtyard, shivering slightly with each gust. It seems insignificant, but Nyatsimba notices it too. She mentions, almost idly, that fences like that are built not just to keep goats out, but to make a particular sound when the wind is right, a low hum that signals the approach of certain seasonal winds. No one writes this down. It's simply known, passed from builder to builder. The conversation, if you can call it that, drifts to the Portuguese traders, who have been making increasingly bold attempts to influence local politics. Nyatsimba's mouth curves, almost imperceptibly, in something that could be a smile, or just the shadow of one. They watched the sun, she says. We watched the rain. In that moment, a drop falls not into the copper bowl, but onto your bare arm. Cool, sudden, uncertain. The first one always is. The first drop is followed by another, and then another, until the copper bowl's ripples begin to overlap. Nyatsimba tilts her head slightly, as though listening to a song you can't quite hear yet. The scent of rain rises quickly, rich and earthy, like the world has just turned over in its sleep. The queen does not move from her seat. In this court, rain is not an interruption, it's an event. People begin appearing from doorways and shaded alcoves, as if summoned by the quiet drumming on the thatched roofs. Some carry jars to collect the water, others simply watch. The air feels cooler now, though it might just be your imagination playing along with the rhythm. You learn something unexpected. The Queen's rain jars aren't just for telling time. They're also used in ceremonies to bless the planting season. The first rain of the year is believed to carry a kind of living memory, linking the present to rains that fell decades or even centuries before. Whether you believe that or not, there's something undeniably hypnotic about the way the drops fall in uneven, unhurried intervals, like a conversation with long silences. Nyatsimba gestures for you to follow her into a covered walkway. The ground beneath is slick now, the red clay deepening in color as it drinks the rain. You step carefully, partly to keep your footing, and partly because it seems wrong to rush here. The Queen's pace is steady, not slow, exactly, but unbothered. You suspect she has no concept of being late, unless the rain says so. An attendant joins you, carrying a bundle of reeds bound with twisted fiber. When you ask about them, he explains they're for making rain flutes, simple hollow tubes that sing when the wind blows through them. They're hung from the eaves during storms, so the house itself becomes part of the weather's voice. Historians still debate whether this was purely decorative, or whether it was thought to please certain local spirits. You privately think it's just an excuse to make the rain more interesting to listen to, but you keep that to yourself. As you pass the reed fence again, you notice the sound has changed. Before, it was a soft hum. Now it's a low, wavering note, like the breath of someone just waking up. The Queen notices too, her eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in recognition. The east wind, she says simply, and then says nothing else, as though the wind's name is explanation enough. By the time you reach the next courtyard, the rain has picked up a steady patter that drowns out all but the loudest sounds. Somewhere, a goat bleats again, less indignantly this time, as though it's decided that being damp is an acceptable part of existence. A group of children runs past, barefoot, shrieking with delight as they kick up water. You watch them for a moment and realize that no matter the century, rain always seems to belong to children first. Nyatsimba pauses at a carved wooden post, tracing a fingertip over its spiraling pattern. You've seen these posts before, but never up close. The grooves are so fine they almost look like threads twisted into the wood. She tells you they mark the lineage of the ruling family, each curve representing a generation. It's not a literal record, there are no names or dates, but a kind of memory map that can be read only by those who know the family's history. The rain slows slightly, and you sense that the audience is nearing its end for the day. The Queen says nothing about when you'll meet again, but you have the feeling it will be when the next storm arrives, whether that's in a week or in the next hour. In this place, time is measured differently, and your wristwatch, if you had one, would be as irrelevant as a sundial in the dark. By morning, the world smells of clean clay and green leaves. The air is lighter now, and a faint mist clings to the ground in the low spaces between huts. Somewhere nearby, someone is grinding grain, the steady scrape of stone on stone marking the day's first labors. You step outside into the early light, blinking against its brightness. Nyatsimba is already awake. She sits near the rain jars, which are now brimming, their surfaces perfectly still. She dips a carved gourd into one, letting the water spill slowly back, as though testing its sound. You're told that she always listens to the jars in the morning, as if they might tell her something about the day ahead. The idea seems a little absurd, but you've learned by now that absurdity often has a way of being quietly practical here. The major historical fact for today: under Nyatsimba's reign, the Mutopa Kingdom maintained a careful balance between inland trade routes and coastal exchanges. Gold from the rivers and ivory from the forests made their way east toward the Indian Ocean, where Swahili and Arab merchants carried them even further. This web of connections kept the kingdom both wealthy and influential, though at the cost of constantly negotiating with people who never stopped wanting more. As you watch, a small boy approaches with a clay pot painted in white zigzag patterns. He sets it beside the Queen without a word. She takes a long look at the pot before nodding apparently. This means something significant, but no one explains what. Later, you'll learn it's part of a rain offering custom. Certain families bring decorated pots to the ruler after the first big storm of the season. Historians still debate whether the patterns were meant to be symbolic, or if they were just the ancient equivalent of the nicest design we had lying around. You're invited to walk with the Queen through the morning market. It's less crowded than you'd expect, Most people are still at home, tending fires or gathering water, but the stalls that are open spill with bright fabrics, baskets of dried fish, and strings of beads that glitter in the sun. The smells are mixed: wood smoke, salt, and the faint sweetness of fermenting millet beer. Nyatsimba stops at a stall selling tiny carved animals, each no larger than your thumb. She picks up a hippo and turns it over in her hand. "For the rain," she says, before handing it back. You don't ask for clarifications. Sometimes it's better to let mysteries remain mysteries. From the market, you pass back toward the reed fence again. Its hum is gone now, replaced by the rustle of drying leaves caught in its weave. You remember how it sounded yesterday, and for a moment, you find yourself wondering whether you'll ever hear that exact tone again. Probably not, and maybe that's the point. At the edge of the enclosure, the queen stops to look out over the valley. The fields below are already dotted with figures turning the wet soil. A flock of white birds wheels overhead, catching the light in sudden flashes. You can feel the heat beginning to rise again, slow but steady, the kind that will make the air shimmer by midday. Nyatsimba turns back toward the rain jars. "The drops will tell us," she says, and then, as if the conversation is finished, walks away. The heat builds as the day stretches forward, the kind of heat that makes even shadows look tired. You find yourself drifting toward the shade of a large baobab, its trunk thick and weathered, like the library of some ancient storyteller who only speaks to the wind. Nyatsimba is nowhere to be seen for the moment apparently. This is a time of day when everyone simply becomes part of the landscape. A pair of young women are weaving mats nearby, their fingers moving with mechanical patience. The reeds whisper against each other as they are pulled tight, producing a rhythm almost like a quiet song. You think about how many hours of work it takes to produce something that will spend its entire life being stepped on. The irony isn't lost on you. The major fact for today: the Mutapa rulers, including Nyatsimba, held political control through a mix of hereditary leadership and a network of appointed chiefs, who managed smaller territories. This system wasn't perfect, no system ever is, but it allowed the kingdom to stretch across vast areas without falling apart at the seams. When disputes arose, they were often resolved in meetings that could last days, punctuated by meals, long silences, and the occasional pointed proverb. One of the weavers tells you an odd tidbit. Some elders here believe that baobab trees can hold rainwater in their trunks, not in the literal sense of a reservoir, but as a kind of memory. When rain returns after a long drought, they say it's because the baobabs have finally decided to release it. Historians still debate whether this is just a poetic metaphor, or if there's some real observation hidden in it. You like the idea. That's the kind of explanation that feels truer than it is. A boy runs past with a reed flute, puffing out notes that wobble uncertainly in the hot air. You recognize it as the same kind of flute you saw bundled yesterday. Its tone rises and falls in little gusts, like it can't quite decide if it's a song or an argument. The boy stops briefly to show it to you. He's decorated it with a band of bright beads that clink softly when he moves. In the distance, you hear the low, steady beat of a drum. It's not the lively, dance-inducing kind. This is slower, ceremonial, a heartbeat stretched out into something communal. The weavers pause, glance toward the sound, and resume their work without comment. The drum, they seem to say, will keep beating whether you listen or not. The sun shifts slightly, and the baobab shadow moves enough to make you adjust your seat. You remember Nyatsimba's words. The sun doesn't give time. Yet here you are, moving because of it. Maybe both the sun and the rain are in on the joke. As afternoon drapes itself over the land, a faint breeze stirs the dust. It's not enough to cool you, but it carries the scent of something cooking stew, perhaps, with groundnuts and leafy greens. Somewhere, someone laughs, short and sharp, as though they've just won a quiet victory in a game you can't see. You feel a subtle change in the air, like the shift between breaths. Maybe it's the wind, maybe it's your own heartbeat slowing, or maybe it's the sound of raindrops waiting their turn again. By late afternoon, the queen returns. She's walking slowly, not because she's tired, but because the day has taught her there's rarely a reason to arrive anywhere quickly. At her side is an older man carrying a wooden box with brass hinges. The box is not large, but it is handled with the same care you might give a fragile egg or a dangerous secret. She sits beneath the same canopy as before, motioning for you to join her. The man sets the box between you and steps back, his hands clasped behind him. Nyatsimba opens it, revealing a collection of small, smooth stones, each marked with faint carvings. They're arranged in neat rows, though you get the feeling their exact placement is more important than it looks. Today's historical fact: the Mutapa court often used symbolic object stones, beads, carved figurines in council meetings. Each one represented a particular agreement, alliance, or obligation. Moving or removing one could signal a shift in policy. It's a political language made entirely of things you could fit in your hand. Nyatsimba picks up a stone shaped like a teardrop and places it beside the copper rain bowl. You don't ask what it means. You've learned by now that explanations arrive here only when they're ready. Instead, you watch the way she turns it slightly, as though angling it toward an unseen witness. An obscure tidbit drifts into the conversation. In some ceremonies, the court would deliberately delay starting until a bird known as the rain-calling cuckoo made its distinctive cry. The bird might not appear for hours or at all, which meant that important gatherings could stretch into whole days of polite waiting. Historians still debate whether this was a genuine belief in the bird's influence or simply a very refined way of avoiding hasty decisions. The air has shifted against subtle but undeniable. The breeze is stronger, carrying with it the same faint metallic scent you noticed before the last storm. Nyatsimba notices too. She lifts her gaze toward the low clouds gathering at the edge of the sky, then back to the rainbow, still holding the memory of yesterday's drops. You glance toward the reed fence. It hums again, just barely, as if clearing its throat before speaking. A few children stop to listen, their heads tilted, as though waiting for it to finish its thought. The queen speaks finally. The drops will speak before the sun leaves. It's not a prediction so much as an acknowledgement, like mentioning that night will follow day. You lean back slightly, letting her words settle into the warm air. By the time the light begins to soften, you can hear the first scattered taps on the roof light. Tentative, like fingers testing a drumskin. You know by now it's only the beginning. The first few drops are patient. They fall far apart, giving the copper bowl time to compose itself between each ripple. Then they grow bolder, finding a rhythm that feels less like an interruption and more like a decision. By the time the rain is steady, the air has cooled just enough to make you forget how heavy the day had been. Nyatsimba leans back against the carved post behind her. She's not watching the rain so much as listening to it, as though the sound contains instructions only she can decipher. Around you, people slip quietly into the courtyard, traders, elders, attendants each taking a place along the wall. No one speaks until the rain has truly settled in, which you now understand is a sort of unspoken protocol. Today's major fact: in the Mutapa court, rainfall was considered an auspicious time for certain kinds of decisions, especially those involving trade or alliances. The belief was that rain washed away ill intentions and left only what was genuine. Of course, whether this was a sincere conviction or just a poetic excuse for scheduling meetings during cooler hours is a question historians still tilt their heads over. A low table is brought out, covered in woven cloth and topped with bowls of dried fruits, nuts, and roasted maize. The maize kernels are crisp and smoky, almost too hot from their recent roasting, and you find yourself rolling them between your fingers to cool them before eating. The rain deepens, the sound thickening as it runs off the thatched roofs. Somewhere behind you, the reed fence has joined in, adding its wavering note to the chorus. It's as though the entire enclosure is playing along with the storm. An obscure cultural tidbit emerges in the conversation between two elders near you. Certain families keep jars of the first rainwater in a season and use it months later to wake seeds before planting. The idea is that seeds touched by the first rain will remember the rhythm of growth. Whether plants actually have that sort of memory is another matter entirely. You can't help but picture a very confused seed thinking, "Ah yes, this drizzle feels familiar." Nyatsimba speaks briefly, her voice soft enough that people lean in to catch it. You notice she measures her words in the same way she measures time, letting them fall like drops, each carrying more weight for the space around it. The discussion drifts between matters of trade and subtle shifts in the behavior of neighboring territories. You understand maybe a third of the details, but you catch the important part. Nothing will be decided today. The rain's message, it seems, is to wait. When the storm begins to lighten, the queen rises. The meeting dissolves without a single clap or call to signal its end, just a shared awareness that the moment has passed. People drift away as easily as they arrived. You follow the path back toward the baobab tree, the damp earth soft beneath your feet. The tree smells sweeter now, its bark darkened by the rain, as if it has been quietly drinking while you weren't looking. Morning arrives with a clarity that feels almost sharp after the softened edges of last night's rain. The sky is a pale, unmarred blue, the kind that makes every sound seem to travel further. Somewhere to your left, a woman is singing while pounding grain, her voice steady and unhurried. Nyatsimba is already walking the paths between the fields, her bare feet leaving shallow impressions in the wet soil. You fall into step beside her, though it feels less like walking with her, and more like trying to keep pace with a river. She stops, often not to rest, but to notice. A cluster of wildflowers, a line of ants, moving cargo much larger than themselves. The way the light catches in the damp grass. Today's historical fact: the Mutopa rulers often took direct interest in agricultural cycles, not as farmers themselves but as coordinators of seasonal rituals and overseers of resource distribution. Grain stores, irrigation paths, and planting dates could all fall under the ruler's influence, which made attention to the weather more than just a poetic habit, was policy. As you walk, she gestures toward a line of small, flat stones set into the earth. You'd overlooked them at first, assuming they were random. But she explains they're part of a rain-measuring path. Each stone marks where puddles linger longest after a storm. It's a quiet kind of data collection, done over decades. Historians still debate whether such systems were intentionally designed or simply evolved from habit. An attendant appears carrying 2 clay cups filled with a pale, slightly sour drink. You take a cautious sip. It's fermented millet, cool and faintly fizzy, tasting somewhere between bread and grass. You're not entirely convinced it's meant for refreshment, so much as for participation in a shared morning ritual. A curious tidbit surfaces as Nyatsimba greets an elder by the fields. Certain harvest celebrations involve deliberately planting a small patch of wild crops, plants left to grow untended, so the ancestors will have something to eat. The logic is that even the unseen deserve a share of the season. You can't help but imagine some very content ancestral spirit leaning on a cloud, chewing on a ghostly ear of maize. The morning deepens into midday, and the warmth returns, though softened by the damp soil's cool breath. From the fields, you can see the reed fence in the distance, its pale strands catching the sunlight. It's quiet now, but you know it can sing when the wind wants it to. Nyatsimba pauses on the path, looking toward the horizon where dark clouds are beginning to gather again. She doesn't smile, but there's a shift in her. Is a recognition, perhaps, or the faint satisfaction of seeing an old friend on the way. The drops are coming back, she says, and you believe her. By late afternoon, the light has taken on that hazy, diffused quality that warns of rain long before the first drop falls. The air is heavier now, clinging to your skin in a way that makes even small movements feel deliberate. You pass the reed fence, and it's already humming a low, tentative note, like it's tuning itself before the performance. Nyatsimba is seated beneath the canopy again, a fresh copper bowl placed before her. The old one has been set aside, still carrying yesterday's memory in a thin layer of water. She gestures for you to sit, though you notice her gaze is not on you, but on the clouds rolling in from the east. Today's historical fact: the Mutopa kingdom maintained strong connections with the Swahili coastal cities, exchanging gold and ivory for textiles, glass beads, and imported ceramics. These goods often found their way into court life, not as necessities but as symbols, proof of the ruler's far-reaching influence. It's possible the copper bowl itself came from such a trade. Historians still debate the exact origin of certain artifacts, since trade routes were rarely simple lines and more often tangled webs. An attendant sets down a wooden platter between you, filled with slices of baobab fruit. You've tasted it before, but this time it's fresh, not dried, soft, tangy with a sweetness that fades almost as soon as it appears. You wonder how many centuries people have sat in this same spot, eating the same fruit, waiting for the rain. A cultural tidbit drifts into conversation when a young girl joins the group, carrying a reed basket filled with small clay figures. She explains they're rain messengers, figurines, placed near streams or ponds to remind the clouds of where water is needed. Whether this is a symbolic ritual or a charming superstition isn't entirely clear, but you like the image of the clouds needing little clay signposts to do their job. The first drops begin, polite at first, falling so softly they barely disturb the water in the copper bowl. Nyatsimba glances at them, the way one might glance at a messenger's opening words, listening for tone before content. The rhythm builds slowly, and soon the reed fence joins in, its hum rising and falling like breath. People gather again, though this time it's a smaller group perhaps, because the clouds arrived earlier than expected. There's no urgency in their steps. Everyone moves at the same unhurried pace, as though they know the rain will wait for them. Nyatsimba lifts a hand, and a hush falls over the courtyard. "The drops are short today," she says. "The path will not be long." You don't know if she means the rain, the meeting, or something else entirely. In this place, such statements are often left to drift, unanchored, into the air. The rain intensifies quickly this time, skipping the long prelude it offered before. It drums against the roof, pooling in the corners of the courtyard, where the ground dips slightly. The copper bowl fills faster than before, ripples stacking over one another until the surface looks like a field of small hills. Nyatsimba's eyes are half-lidded, but you can tell she's counting not numbers, exactly, but something more fluid. You wonder if she's marking the spaces between drops, the change in their weight, or the way the sound shifts when the wind turns. Today's major fact, the Mutopa Kingdom, at its height, was known for its strategic use of rivers as both trade routes and political boundaries. Controlling the flow of goods along these waters was as much about reading the seasons as it was about negotiating with neighbors. Here, knowledge of rainfall patterns wasn't just agricultural, it was economic power. An obscure tidbit comes from one of the elders seated nearby. In some villages, rainstorms were believed to be moments when ancestors could walk the land unseen, mingling with the living. People would leave small offerings, grain, fruit, even bits of cooked meat outside during storms, not for the living, but for those invisible guests. Historians still debate whether this belief was widespread or more localized. You imagine a spectral ancestor happily helping themselves to a handful of roasted maize while everyone else waits indoors. The reed fence's hum has deepened into a resonant note now, matching the rhythm of the falling rain. A young boy sits cross-legged beside it, tilting his head to listen closely. When the wind shifts, the tone changes, and he grins as though it's told him a joke. Nyatsimba speaks briefly, her words nearly lost under the rain's steady voice. The people around her nod, a slow, deliberate movement, as if agreeing to something that will take years to unfold. You wish you could catch every word, but perhaps that's not the point. Some decisions here seem to belong as much to the weather as to the people. As the storm begins to ease, the clouds break just enough to let in a muted light. The air smells sharp and green, the way it always does when the world has just been rinsed. Nyatsimba rises without ceremony. The audience over, you follow her through the damp courtyard, past the copper bowl still quivering with the memory of drops. She pauses by the reed fence, placing her palm lightly against it. "The wind will change soon," she says, and then, without looking back, she walks away. The morning after the storm is crisp, almost startling in its clarity. The horizon looks nearer, as if the rain has drawn it closer for inspection. You walk the narrow path toward the baobab tree, the red earth still damp enough to hold your footprints. Somewhere ahead, a faint metallic clink drifts through the air, irregular and deliberate. You find Nyatsimba crouched beside a line of rain jars, gently tapping their rims with a carved stick. Each jar produces a slightly different note depending on its size, the depth of water, and perhaps some secret variable known only to her. It's less like she's making music, and more like she's checking an instrument before a performance. Today's historical fact: the Mutopa court maintained multiple rain jars, each stationed in a different part of the enclosure, to compare rainfall between locations. The practice was as much about symbolism as it was about measurement, demonstrating attentiveness to the land's needs in a visible, almost ceremonial way. Historians still debate whether the differences between jars were recorded in any systematic fashion or simply absorbed into oral memory. You crouch beside her, listening. The notes are soft, almost private, but they carry a strange precision somewhere between a calendar and a lullaby. She pauses to adjust the tilt of one jar, catching a trickle of leftover water from the eaves. The drop lands with a quiet plip, and she nods as if confirming something she already suspected. An obscure tidbit emerges when an attendant joins you, carrying a woven pouch filled with what look like small, polished seeds. They are mungunda, he explains, lucky seeds collected during the first rain of a season. Some people keep them as charms. Others grind them into powder and mix it into planting soil, believing it will teach the crops to grow straight. Whether it works or not, the belief persists, passing from one planting season to the next. A breeze stirs, and the reed fence hums faintly, though the sound is softer than you've heard before. Perhaps it's still waking up from yesterday's performance. Nyatsimba glances toward it, her gaze unreadable. When she finally speaks, it's in that unhurried way you've grown accustomed to. "The land drinks," she says, and you realize she's not just talking about the soil. By midday, the sky is a clean, uninterrupted blue. The heat is back, not oppressive yet, but with a clear intention to become so. Nyatsimba has moved to the shade of the baobab tree, where she sits on a mat woven from reeds as fine as hair. The mat is old but well cared for, its edges reinforced with fresh fibers that blend almost invisibly into the original weave. Today's historical fact: rulers of the Mutapa kingdom often held audiences outdoors during the dry hours, under shade trees or canopies. This wasn't just for comfort, it was a statement of connection to the land, a reminder that governance didn't happen in isolation from the fields, forests, and rivers that sustained the people. As you sit beside her, a group of women passes carrying wide, flat baskets piled high with millet. They move in an easy rhythm, balancing the weight without breaking stride. One pauses to greet Nyatsimba and sets her basket down briefly, revealing the intricate spiral pattern woven into its base. You're told that certain spirals represent rainfall years, each turn marking a particularly good season. Historians still debate whether the patterns were meant as practical records or simply as beautiful designs with coincidental meanings. An obscure tidbit comes when an elder seated nearby begins talking about the whispering ground. This is a patch of earth, somewhere beyond the far fields, where the soil makes a faint hissing sound when rain first touches it. No one seems entirely sure why. Some say it's the shape of the ground. Others say it's a spirit's breath, escaping after a long wait. You can't decide which explanation you prefer. Nyatsimba watches the path leading to the reed fence, though nothing stirs there. She seems content to simply observe, as if waiting for something invisible to pass by. The air is still, but you think you hear a faint vibration, maybe the memory of the fence's last song. Someone brings out a shallow bowl of spiced groundnut paste, served with small pieces of roasted yam. The paste is rich, almost smoky, and clings to your fingers in a way that makes you slow down just to savor it. The queen eats in silence, her gaze fixed on the distance where the horizon blurs into heat. Then, without looking at you, she says, "The drops will return when the ground is ready." And as with so many of her statements, you're left wondering whether she means later today, next week, or in some sense that can't be measured at all. The next morning greets you with a pale, silvery light, the kind that makes the landscape feel almost weightless. Dew clings to the grass in tiny spheres, catching the early sun like a scattering of beads. Somewhere nearby, a rooster offers a half-hearted crow, as if even it isn't convinced the day is worth rushing into. Nyatsimba is walking along the edge of the fields, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. You follow at a respectful distance, the wet grass soaking your ankles. She stops, often not at random, but in places that seem to hold some private meaning. Once, she crouches to run her fingers through a shallow puddle, swirling it until the water clears and reveals a small stone beneath. She leaves the stone exactly where it is. Today's historical fact: the Mutapa rulers were not only political figures, but also seen as custodians of the land's fertility. Seasonal rituals, offerings, and symbolic acts like stirring rainwater were part of maintaining harmony between the people and the environment. Historians still debate how much of this was rooted in deep spiritual belief versus political theater designed to affirm authority. An obscure tidbit surfaces when an attendant points toward a clump of tall grass swaying slightly despite the still air. Hidden inside, he says, is a rain spider, a harmless but rather large creature whose webs are said to predict the weather. The direction of the web's opening, they claim, hints at whether rain will come from the east or west. You decide not to look too closely, preferring to take his word for it. The reed fence is quiet this morning, its pale strands unmoving. But Nyatsimba stops beside it anyway, pressing her palm lightly against the woven surface as though greeting an old friend. You notice she keeps her hand there longer than usual, eyes half closed. From somewhere within the enclosure, the faint sound of an mbira drifts through the air, slow, deliberate, each note spaced far apart. It's not music to dance to. It's music that feels like it's tracing the outline of something you can't quite see. When she finally speaks, Nyatsimba says only, "The drops are listening." It's the kind of sentence that leaves more questions than answers, which, you're beginning to suspect, is the point. By mid-afternoon, the heat presses down like a thick blanket. Even the birds seem to have retreated into silence, their songs replaced by the faint buzz of unseen insects. You find a patch of shade beneath the baobab, where the bark is cool against your back. The air smells faintly of dust and distant cooking fires. Nyatsimba arrives with 2 attendants, one carrying a wide clay ball and the other a bundle of fresh reeds. They set them down in the shade, and she begins weaving the reeds into a loose spiral, starting from the center and working outward. You watch as the spiral widens, each reed overlapping the last in a pattern that looks almost like the whirl of a shell. Today's historical fact: spiral patterns appear in many aspects of southern African material culture, from basketry to rock engravings, and often carry symbolic associations with cycles, water, and continuity. In the Mutapa kingdom, such patterns were sometimes incorporated into ceremonial objects, though their exact meanings remain a subject of debate among scholars. An odd tidbit emerges as the queen works. Certain reed spirals, when completed, were once floated on rainwater as offerings. The belief was that if the spiral drifted smoothly without breaking apart, the coming season would be steady. If it unraveled quickly, it was taken as a warning. Whether this was taken literally or treated as a symbolic omen varied from village to village. The reed fence is visible from here, and in the stillness, you think you see it quiver just slightly, like a breath taken in. But no sound follows, and the moment passes. Nyatsimba pauses her weaving to pour a ladle of water from the clay bowl into the spiral's center. The reeds drink it slowly, darkening in color. "The drops need a path," she says quietly, running her fingertip along the curve. You realize she could be talking about the rain, about time, or about something else entirely. And in this heat, with the air so still, you can't bring yourself to ask for clarification. You just watch the spiral take shape, waiting for whatever comes next. Evening arrives slowly, as if the day is reluctant to leave. The sun slides lower, stretching shadows across the courtyard, until they spill into each other and blur. Somewhere near the reed fence, a breeze begins to stir, tentative at first, then steady enough to coax a faint hum from its woven strands. Nyatsimba sits near the copper bowl, its surface reflecting the dimming light in a wavering patch of gold. She is not weaving now, nor speaking, just tracing the rim of the bowl with one fingertip. Around you, people move in quiet patterns, collecting mats, folding cloth, carrying baskets back into storage. The day exhales, and everything softens. Today's historical fact: the Mutapa kingdom's rulers, including Nyatsimba, often used the rhythm of seasonal rains to structure both governance and daily life. Planting, trade expeditions, and even diplomatic meetings could shift according to the cloud's arrival. It wasn't a sign of passivity, but of living in deliberate synchrony with the land. Historians still debate whether this flexibility was a strength or a vulnerability in the long run. An obscure tidbit surfaces when an elder passes by carrying a small clay jug with a reed stopper. He explains it contains last rainwater, the final collection before the dry season. It's kept sealed until the very first day of the next rains, then poured onto the ground as a greeting. The act is more than symbolic. Some say it reminds the earth of its own thirst. The reed fence hums again, its tone rising and falling like a slow conversation. You feel it more than you hear it, a low vibration that sits in the chest. Nyatsimba glances toward it, then back at the copper bowl. She seems content to let the fence speak for the evening. A few scattered drops begin to fall, nothing like the full storms you've seen. Just a gentle tapping, like the sky clearing its throat before sleep. The bowl catches each one, sending out ripples that fade into the gathering dusk. Nyatsimba speaks at last, her voice barely louder than the rain. Every drop remembers where it has been. She leaves the words there, without explanation, and you realize you don't need one. The sky deepens into a deep, velvety blue. The hum of the fence, the soft patter of rain, the faint scent of wet earth, they all blend together until time itself feels like it has thinned. Stretching quietly between moments,